Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. Harry Potter could have pretended he hadn't heard it. It would have been so much easier to slip back around the corner, return to Gryffindor Tower, and let the conversation fade like a half-remembered nightmare. But Hagrid's voice carried through the stone corridor with painful clarity, and the words had already lodged themselves deep in Harry's chest like splinters. "You had to know, Dumbledore. You had to know what they were like." The corridor outside McGonagall's office stretched empty in both directions, lit only by the dancing shadows of torchlight. Harry pressed himself against the cold stone wall, his breath forming small clouds in the December chill that seemed to seep through the castle's ancient bones. He had been heading to return a library book when he'd heard the voices, McGonagall's sharp tones mixing with Hagrid's rumbling bass, and, threading through it all like silk over steel, Dumbledore's measured cadence. Indeed, Hagrid, the Dursleys were precisely what Harry required. Something in the headmaster's voice made Harry's stomach clench. There was no surprise there, no shock at whatever Hagrid had revealed, only a calm acknowledgement that made Harry's skin crawl. "Required," McGonagall's voice cracked like a whip. "Albus, that boy was wearing clothes that could have fitted 3 of him. He was so thin I could count his ribs through his shirt. And you call that required?" Harry's hand moved unconsciously to his side, where his ribs had indeed been visible just months ago. He'd filled out some since coming to Hogwarts, thanks to regular meals and Madame Pumphrey's nutritional potions, but the memory of constant hunger still woke him some nights. The blood protection necessitated certain hardships, Dumbledore said, and Harry could practically hear the man adjusting his spectacles, that familiar gesture he made when delivering uncomfortable truths. Harry needed to understand sacrifice. Suffering builds character, Minerva. It teaches us the value of kindness, the importance of fighting for others who cannot fight for themselves. Suffering? Hagrid's voice rose to nearly a shout before dropping to a horrified whisper. "Albus, they locked him in a cupboard. For 10 years he slept in a cupboard under the stairs. There were bars on his bedroom window. Mrs. Figg told me they'd barely feed him some days, and when I went to collect him for Hogwarts shopping, he thought it was all some cruel joke. He'd never had a birthday cake, Albus, never had a birthday at all." The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring pulled taut. Harry's legs felt suddenly unsteady beneath him, and he slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold stone floor. They had known. All this time, they had known. "The greater good sometimes requires," Dumbledore began. "Don't!" McGonagall's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Don't you dare speak to me of the greater good. That boy asked me yesterday if he could stay at Hogwarts for Christmas because he was afraid to go home. Afraid, Albus. An 11-year-old boy, afraid to return to the people who were supposed to love him." Harry's throat constricted. He had asked Professor McGonagall about staying for the holidays, though he'd tried to frame it as excitement about the castle rather than fear of Privet Drive. The thought of returning to Uncle Vernon's purple-faced shouting and Aunt Petunia's sharp slaps made his hands shake. "Lily's sacrifice created powerful magic," Dumbledore said quietly, but that magic required activation. Harry needed to feel unloved, unwanted. He needed to understand what it meant to be powerless, so that when power came to him, he would not abuse it as Tom Riddle did. The Dursleys were perfect for this purpose, too frightened of magic to risk truly harming him, but sufficiently resentful to ensure he received no affection that might spoil the conditioning. Conditioning. The word hit Harry like a physical blow. He pressed his forehead against his knees, fighting the nausea that rose in his throat. All those years of wondering what he'd done wrong, why he wasn't worthy of love, why even his shadow seemed to offend his relatives. It had been intentional, carefully orchestrated. "You used him," McGonagall said, and her voice carried a tremor Harry had never heard before. "You used a child." "I prepared him," Dumbledore corrected gently, "for what he must face. Tom Riddle was raised in comfort and praise until he came to Hogwarts, and look what that produced. Harry's trials at the Dursleys taught him humility, compassion, the ability to love despite being unloved. These qualities will serve him well in the battles to come." "And what if those trials had broken him instead?" Hagrid demanded. "What if he'd turned dark, like that Riddle? What if he'd given up entirely?" "Then we would have found another way," Dumbledore said simply. "But Harry is his mother's son. I knew he would endure." The casual certainty in the headmaster's voice sent ice through Harry's veins. Another way, as if Harry were nothing more than a weapon to be forged, tested, and discarded if found wanting. Harry rose on unsteady legs, his decision crystallizing like frost on a window. He'd heard enough. More than enough. The walk back to Gryffindor Tower passed in a blur of stone corridors and moving portraits. The common room was empty, except for Ron and Hermione, who looked up from their chess game with matching expressions of concern as Harry stumbled through the portrait hole. "Harry!" Hermione's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look awful. Are you ill?" "I need to ask you something," Harry said, his own voice sounding strange and distant in his ears. "Hypothetically, if someone wanted to leave Hogwarts, not expelled but voluntarily, could they?" Ron's hand froze halfway to moving his knight. "Leave? But why would anyone want to leave Hogwarts? Just answer the question, please." Hermione set down the book she'd been consulting for their next move. "Well, theoretically, yes. There's no law requiring magical children to attend Hogwarts specifically. Some families hire private tutors or send their children abroad." "But Harry, why are you asking this? What would someone need to do? To withdraw, I mean." I'm not entirely certain." Hermione's brow furrowed in thought. "I suppose they'd need to submit a formal request to the headmaster and the Board of Governors." "But Harry, you can't be serious about this. Leaving Hogwarts would be—" "I need to go to the library," Harry said, already turning toward the portrait hole. "Harry, wait." But he was already climbing back through the fat lady's portrait, leaving his friends' worried voices behind. The library felt different at night, its familiar warmth replaced by something vast and echoing. Madame Pince was nowhere to be seen, but the restricted section remained accessible to students conducting research for advanced classes. Harry had used this privilege before, when Professor Quirrell had assigned an essay on defensive magical theory. His fingers traced along spine after spine of ancient volumes until he found what he was looking for. Wizarding Educational Law and Governance, 3rd edition. The book fell open in his hands, as if eager to reveal its secrets. The section on student withdrawal was brief but illuminating. Any magical child could cease their education at Hogwarts with proper documentation. A formal letter of withdrawal, signed by the student and their legal guardian, submitted to both the headmaster and the Hogwarts Board of Governors. Alternative arrangements for magical education could be made through private tutoring, apprenticeships, or enrollment in foreign institutions. But there was another clause, buried deeper in the legal text, that made Harry's heart race. In cases where the legal guardian was deemed unfit, or where the student could demonstrate fundamental breach of educational trust, the student could petition for emancipation and represent themselves in withdrawal proceedings. Harry's hands shook as he copied the relevant passages into a piece of parchment. Fundamental breach of educational trust, willful endangerment or manipulation of a student's well-being for purposes unrelated to their education. The examples given included using students as unpaid labor, endangering them for political purposes, or deliberately placing them in harmful situations under the guise of character building. The law was clear. What Dumbledore had done, what he had admitted to doing, was not just morally reprehensible. It was illegal. Harry spent the next 3 hours researching, his determination growing stronger with each statute he uncovered. By the time he finally returned to Gryffindor Tower, dawn was painting the horizon pink and gold, and his mind was made up. He sat at the desk by the window, pulled out a fresh piece of parchment, and began to write. To the Hogwarts Board of Governors and Headmaster Albus Dumbledore, I, Harry James Potter, do hereby formally withdraw from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, effective immediately, citing fundamental breach of educational trust as defined under Section 127 of the Educational Governance Act of 1769. Evidence supporting this withdrawal includes, but is not limited to, the deliberate placement of this student with abusive relatives for purposes of conditioning rather than protection, the willful endangerment of student welfare under the guise of character development, and the admission by the headmaster that said placement was designed to ensure psychological manipulation rather than student well-being. As per Section 131 of the aforementioned Act, I am exercising my right to petition for educational emancipation, citing the failure of my legal guardians to provide adequate care and protection, and the failure of the headmaster to fulfill his duty of care towards students under his authority. I will be seeking alternative arrangements for my magical education through private tutoring, and shall be available to testify before the Board of Governors should they require clarification of these charges. I request that my personal belongings be made available for collection, and that my academic records be sealed pending resolution of this matter. Respectfully submitted, Harry James Potter, first-year Gryffindor student, House of Potter. Harry's hand trembled as he signed his name, but his signature was firm. As the ink dried on the parchment, he felt something shift inside him. A weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying suddenly lifted from his shoulders. He had been a pawn in Dumbledore's game for too long. But pawns, Harry had learned from watching Ron play chess, could become queens if they just moved far enough forward. And Harry was done being anyone's pawn. The great barn owl he'd arranged to borrow from the owlery hooted softly as Harry tied the letter to its leg. 3 copies, one for Dumbledore, one for the Board of Governors, and one for the Daily Prophet. Let the wizarding world see what the great Albus Dumbledore had done in the name of the greater good. As the owl spread its wings and launched itself into the dawn sky, Harry watched it disappear into the distance and smiled for the first time in days. By noon, he suspected, his life would be very different indeed. Chapter 2. The Dawn Departure. The owlery had never felt more like a sanctuary. Harry stood among the rustling feathers and gentle hoots, watching as 3 more owls took flight into the pre-dawn darkness, each carrying identical copies of his withdrawal letter. The great barn owl had been first, but Harry had learned enough about the wizarding world's postal system to know that important messages required redundancy. 1 owl to Dumbledore's private office, 1 to the Hogwarts Board of Governors, 1 to the Daily Prophet's news desk, and now, as an afterthought that had struck him as brilliantly necessary, 1 to the Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Education. Let them try to claim they hadn't been properly notified. The December air bit at his exposed hands as he watched the last owl disappear into the lightening sky. Somewhere below him, the castle slept on, unaware that everything was about to change. In a few hours his letter would arrive at Dumbledore's office. By afternoon, it would be public knowledge. By evening, the entire wizarding world would know that Harry Potter had walked away from Hogwarts. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a grim satisfaction that settled in his chest like warm butterbeer. Harry made his way back through the castle's corridors, his footsteps echoing softly against the ancient stone. The moving portraits dozed in their frames, and even the ghosts seemed to be keeping to their usual haunts. It was that peculiar hour between night and morning when the castle felt most like itself, not a school full of chattering students, but an ancient fortress that had weathered centuries of secrets and scandals. He was nearly to Gryffindor Tower when a familiar, silvery figure drifted through the wall ahead of him. "Master Potter," Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington said, his nearly headless state making his formal bow look precarious. "You're about early this morning." Harry paused, considering his words. Sir Nicholas had been at Hogwarts for over 500 years. If anyone might have witnessed something like this before, it would be him. "Sir Nicholas," Harry said quietly, "have you ever seen a student leave Hogwarts? Not expelled, but choosing to leave?" The ghost's expression grew thoughtful, his head tilting at an angle that would have been impossible for the living. "Ah," he said softly, "how very interesting that you should ask. Yes, Master Potter, I have indeed witnessed such departures. 3 times, in fact, during my considerable tenure here. What happened to them? That rather depends on the circumstances." Sir Nicholas floated closer, his translucent form shimmering in the torchlight. "The first was a young lady in 1847, Cordelia Blackwood. She left after discovering that her transfiguration professor had been using students as test subjects for experimental spells, went on to establish her own school in Scotland, if memory serves. Quite successful it was, too." Harry's heart rate quickened. Someone else had left because of a professor's misconduct. "The second," Sir Nicholas continued, "was less noble in his motivations. Edmund Forley, in 1923, withdrew after a cheating scandal. His family was deeply embarrassed, though I hear he made quite a fortune in dragon breeding later on. And the third—" The ghost paused, his silvery eyes studying Harry with sudden intensity. "The third was Abraxas Malfoy in 1943. He claimed that certain influences at the school were incompatible with his family's values. Left just before some rather unpleasant business with a monster in the castle, if I recall correctly. Never did learn what became of that particular situation." 1943. The same year Tom Riddle had been at Hogwarts. Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. "Sir Nicholas," Harry said carefully, "what do you think happens when students leave like that? To the school, I mean." "Change, Master Potter. Always change. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. But Hogwarts has weathered many storms over the centuries. It adapts, as all ancient institutions must." The ghost's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Though I must say, the departure of someone as notable as yourself would likely cause quite the stir indeed." Harry nodded slowly. "Thank you, Sir Nicholas, for the history lesson. Think nothing of it, dear boy, and whatever you may be contemplating, for I suspect this conversation is not purely academic, I hope you know that you carry the goodwill of many who have observed your character these past months." The ghost drifted away, leaving Harry alone with the weight of centuries pressing down around him. 3 students in over 500 years. He was about to become the 4th. The Gryffindor common room was empty and dark when Harry climbed through the portrait hole. The dying embers in the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the familiar red and gold furnishings that had become so much more of a home than Privet Drive ever was. For a moment, doubt crept in. This room, with its comfortable armchairs and the chess set still waiting from last night's interrupted game, represented everything he'd dreamed of during those long years locked in his cupboard. But dreams, Harry had learned, could be built on lies as easily as truth. He climbed the stairs to the dormitory, where Ron's snores provided a steady counterpoint to Neville's quieter breathing. Dean and Seamus slept soundly in their beds, all of them blissfully unaware that one of their roommates was about to disappear from their lives as suddenly as he'd entered them. Harry moved quietly to his trunk, grateful for the silencing charms that seemed to muffle sound in the dormitory. His belongings fit easily into the magically expanded space. A few sets of robes, his textbooks, the photo album Hagrid had given him, and his father's invisibility cloak. Everything that mattered to him in the world could be packed in less than 10 minutes. The thought should have been depressing, but instead it felt liberating. He left 2 letters on his pillow, one for Ron, one for Hermione. The words had been difficult to find, but he'd tried to explain without betraying the full scope of what he'd overheard. They deserved to know he wasn't abandoning them out of anger or fickleness, but they didn't need to carry the burden of Dumbledore's confession. That weight was his alone. The last thing he packed was his wand, sliding it carefully into his jacket pocket. 11 inches of holly and phoenix feather, the brother to Voldemort's wand. Even that connection felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of how carefully orchestrated his entire life had been. Harry was closing his trunk when a soft trill filled the air. He looked up to see Fawkes perched on the windowsill, the phoenix's magnificent red and gold plumage seeming to glow in the pale dawn light filtering through the diamond-paned windows. "Fawkes?" Harry whispered, not wanting to wake his roommates. "What are you doing here?" The phoenix regarded him with ancient, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding Harry couldn't fathom. Fawkes trilled again, softer this time, and Harry could have sworn he heard approval in the musical sound. The great bird spread one wing, revealing a single tail feather that drifted to the floor at Harry's feet. Harry picked up the feather, its surface warm to the touch despite the December cold. Phoenix feathers were incredibly rare and valuable, he knew from his defense against the dark arts readings. But more than that, they were said to be given only to those the phoenix deemed worthy of trust. "Thank you," Harry whispered, tucking the feather carefully into his pocket alongside his wand. Fawkes trilled once more, a sound that seemed to echo with centuries of wisdom and sorrow, then spread his wings and disappeared in a flash of golden flame that left no trace of heat or smoke behind. Harry stood in the empty dormitory for a long moment, his trunk handle solid and familiar in his grip. Somewhere in the castle below, Professor McGonagall would soon be starting her morning rounds. She would find his empty bed, read his letters to Ron and Hermione, and realize what had happened. The thought of her expression, shock, worry, perhaps even betrayal, made his chest tight with guilt. But he had made his choice. For the first time in his life, Harry James Potter was choosing his own path rather than following the one laid out for him by others. The walk through the castle felt different now, charged with finality. Each portrait, each stone arch, each familiar turn might be the last time he saw them. The moving staircases seemed to sense his departure, settling into helpful configurations without their usual mischievous rearrangements. Even the castle, it seemed, was bidding him farewell. He paused at the great oak doors that led to the grounds, his hand on the ancient iron handle. Beyond those doors lay uncertainty. No predetermined path, no carefully orchestrated lessons, no manipulative headmaster pulling strings from the shadows. Just Harry, his choices, and whatever consequences followed. The handle turned easily under his grip, and cold morning air rushed in to greet him. The sun was rising properly now, painting the grounds in shades of gold and pink that made even the giant Squid's Lake surface gleam like molten metal. It was beautiful, Harry realized. Perhaps the most beautiful sunrise he'd ever seen. Behind him, Hogwarts stood ancient and eternal, its towers piercing the morning sky like something from a fairy tale. Students would wake soon, and the great hall would fill with the chatter of breakfast. Professor Quirrell would stutter through his defense lessons, Snape would terrorize first years in potions, and McGonagall would transform matchsticks with stern precision. But Harry wouldn't be there to see any of it. He shouldered his trunk and stepped out into the December morning, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Each step took him further from the life Dumbledore had planned for him, and closer to something entirely unknown. By the time he reached the edge of the grounds, the sun had cleared the horizon entirely, and somewhere behind him, Harry knew that Professor McGonagall was discovering an empty dormitory and 2 letters that would change everything. The thought brought him no joy, but it brought him something perhaps more valuable: the fierce satisfaction of a choice made freely, without manipulation or coercion. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter belonged entirely to himself. And that, he thought, as he walked toward an uncertain future, was worth any price he might have to pay. Chapter 3. The Flu Network explodes. Lucius Malfoy was enjoying his morning coffee in the conservatory of Malfoy Manor when Draco's letter arrived. The owl, one of Hogwarts's school birds rather than the family's usual peacock post, should have been the first sign that something was amiss. The second was the barely legible scrawl of his son's handwriting, clearly written in haste. Father, something extraordinary has happened. Potter has left Hogwarts, withdrawn completely. McGonagall found his dormitory empty this morning, with only letters for his friends. The entire school is in chaos. Even the professors seem stunned. Dumbledore has been in emergency meetings all morning. I thought you should know immediately. Your son, Draco. Lucius set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, his mind already racing through the implications. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who had defied the Dark Lord and lived to tell the tale, had voluntarily withdrawn from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The political ramifications were staggering. Narcissa, he called, his voice carrying the particular tone that meant urgent family business. His wife appeared in the conservatory doorway within moments, her keen blue eyes already alert to the possibility of opportunity or crisis. What is it? Harry Potter has left Hogwarts. Lucius handed her Draco's letter, watching her face carefully as she read. Narcissa Malfoy had perhaps the sharpest political mind in all of Britain, though she preferred to exercise it from behind the scenes. Her reaction would tell him everything he needed to know about how to proceed. Her eyebrows rose incrementally as she reached the end of the letter. Left, she repeated. Not expelled. Left. So it would seem. Lucius, she said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of pure blood political maneuvering. Do you realize what this means? That the most famous wizard in Britain is now without institutional protection or guidance, Lucius replied. That he's 11 years old, presumably alone, and quite possibly in need of alternative arrangements. Narcissa's smile was razor-sharp. Exactly. Contact Theodore Nott immediately. Then Avery, Rawle, and Selwyn. Emergency flu conference in the study. Now. Lucius was already moving toward the fireplace before she finished speaking. In the space of 5 minutes, the Malfoy study was filled with the crackling green flames of 4 active flu connections, the floating heads of some of Britain's most influential pure-blood patriarchs waiting expectantly in the fire. Gentlemen, Lucius began without preamble, I trust you've all heard the news from Hogwarts. About Potter? Theodore Nott Sr.'s aristocratic features were sharp with interest. My son sent word an hour ago. The boy simply vanished, apparently. Left in the night like a common runaway. Hardly common, Avery interjected, his scarred face thoughtful. This is Harry Potter we're discussing. The child doesn't do anything without the entire wizarding world taking notice. Which brings us to the question, Selwyn said in his clipped tones, of why he left. Dumbledore's been his champion since birth. For Potter to abandon Hogwarts suggests either a falling out with the headmaster or... Or what? Rawle demanded. Or he's finally realized that his current guardians are inadequate to his needs, Narcissa said smoothly, stepping into view of the flu flames. The men's attention sharpened immediately. Narcissa Malfoy didn't involve herself in political discussions unless she had something significant to contribute. Lady Malfoy, Nott inclined his head respectfully. You believe the boy is seeking new arrangements? I believe, Narcissa said with careful precision, that Harry Potter is 11 years old, magically powerful beyond measure, politically naive, and currently without proper guidance or protection. I also believe that whichever family succeeds in offering him sanctuary will gain influence beyond measure. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. The Muggle relatives, Avery said finally. Dumbledore placed him with Muggles. Disgraceful, really. No proper magical education, no understanding of his heritage or responsibilities. No knowledge of pure blood customs or political obligations, Lucius added. The boy probably doesn't even realize what he's entitled to. The Potter fortune alone would make him one of the wealthiest wizards in Britain, and that's before considering his political standing. Exactly, Narcissa said. He's been deliberately kept ignorant, raised like a common Muggle. Any pure-blood family who takes him in would have the opportunity to provide the education and guidance Dumbledore has so clearly failed to offer. Raoul's expression was calculating. The other families will realize this as well. We'll need to move quickly. Agreed, Nott said. But carefully. Potter may be politically naive, but he's not stupid. Heavy-handed approaches will likely drive him away. What do we know of his current dispositions? Selwyn asked. His friends at school, his preferences, his prejudices? Lucius considered the question. Draco's letters over the past months had painted a picture of Potter as frustratingly resistant to proper, pure-blood influence, but also as someone clearly uncomfortable with his fame and status. The boy had befriended a Weasley, a blood traitor family, but still pure blood, and the Muggle-born Granger girl. His preferences seemed to lean toward those who treated him as a person rather than a symbol. He's idealistic, Lucius said finally, influenced by Dumbledore's rhetoric about equality and tolerance. But he's also been ignored and mistreated by his Muggle guardians, according to Dumbledore's own statements to the Wizengamot. He may be more receptive to proper magical guidance than we might initially assume. Especially, Narcissa added shrewdly, if that guidance comes with genuine care and protection. The boy has been starved of both, if the rumors about his relatives are true. Then we're agreed? Nott asked. A coordinated approach? Coordinated, yes, but not unified, Narcissa said. We each have different strengths to offer. Competition will serve us better than cooperation in this case. Let Potter choose from among our best offers rather than presenting him with a single option he might reject. The men exchanged glances through the flue flames. It was a risky strategy. Pure-blood families rarely competed so openly for influence, but the prize was unprecedented. I'll draft a formal invitation to Malfoy Manor, Lucius said. Full honors, of course. The boy should understand what true wizarding hospitality looks like. I'll contact the Greengrasses, Nott said. Cyrus has been complaining for years that his daughters need more stimulating company. Having Potter as a ward would certainly qualify. As the other men began outlining their strategies, Narcissa stepped back from the fireplace, her mind already moving beyond the immediate politics. Somewhere across Britain, other pure-blood families would be having similar conversations. The Longbottoms, certainly. Augusta would never pass up the chance to champion the son of her beloved Lily Evans. The Bones family, perhaps, through Amelia's position in the ministry. Even some of the more liberal pure-bloods, like the Abbots, might see opportunity in offering Potter sanctuary. But there was one family Narcissa was particularly concerned about, one whose involvement could complicate matters significantly. Lucius, she said quietly, as the flu conference began to wind down. Has anyone contacted Andromeda? Her husband's expression darkened slightly. Andromeda Tonks, formerly Andromeda Black, was Narcissa's estranged older sister, burned from the family tapestry decades ago for marrying a Muggle-born. But blood was blood, and Andromeda still carried the Black family's political instincts, even if she'd chosen to use them in service of more liberal causes. Would she involve herself? Lucius asked. If she thinks we're all circling Potter like vultures, Absolutely. Narcissa's smile was grim, and she'll position herself as the reasonable alternative to our dark family influence. Mark my words, Lucius. By evening, Potter will have received invitations from half the pure-blood families in Britain. As if summoned by her words, another flue call began crackling to life in the fireplace. This time, the dignified features of Augusta Longbottom materialized in the flames, her expression already sharp with purpose. Lucius! Narcissa! The dowager's voice carried decades of authority. I assume you've heard about young Potter's situation. Lady Longbottom, Narcissa replied smoothly. How good to hear from you. Indeed. I'll be brief. I'm calling a meeting of the Light families for this afternoon. 2 o'clock, Longbottom Hall. I trust you'll pass word along to any other concerned parties. The implication was clear. Augusta was rallying her own coalition in response to the Dark family's maneuvering. The game was escalating already. Of course, Narcissa said gracefully, though I do hope we can all approach young Potter's situation with his best interests at heart, rather than political considerations. Augusta's laugh was dry as parchment. My dear Narcissa, when have the pure-blood families ever done anything without political considerations? At least let's be honest about our motivations. The flue connection ended, leaving Lucius and Narcissa alone in their study. Through the tall windows, the December sun was climbing toward its zenith, and somewhere in Britain, Harry Potter was discovering just how quickly his simple decision to leave school could reshape the entire political landscape. Well, Narcissa said finally, settling into one of the leather armchairs by the fire. This should be interesting. Lucius poured himself another cup of coffee, his mind already drafting the letter that would change everything. Indeed, though I suspect young Potter has no idea what he's unleashed. Perhaps that's for the best, Narcissa mused. The boy's been manipulated quite enough by Dumbledore. At least now he'll have choices. Assuming he's wise enough to make the right ones. Narcissa's smile was sharp and predatory. Oh, my dear husband, I have every confidence that we can help him see the wisdom in choosing correctly. As the morning sun climbed higher over the British countryside, letters began flying from manor houses and ancestral estates across the land. By noon, the most famous 11-year-old in the wizarding world would discover that leaving Hogwarts had been the easy part. Choosing what came next would be infinitely more complicated. Chapter 4. The Greengrass Gambit. The leaky cauldron had never felt quite so much like a refuge. Harry sat in the darkest corner of the pub, his trunk tucked safely beside his chair, nursing a mug of hot chocolate that Tom the barkeeper had provided without question. The wizarding world's most famous 11-year-old, it seemed, was still too young for anything stronger than cocoa, regardless of the circumstances that had brought him here. The morning crowd was thin, a few ministry workers grabbing quick breakfasts before disapparating to work, an elderly witch reading the Daily Prophet with increasing agitation, and a nervous-looking young man who kept glancing at Harry and whispering to his companion. Word of his departure from Hogwarts hadn't reached the Prophet yet, but it would soon enough. Harry was contemplating his next move when a familiar voice spoke from behind him. You know, Potter, when most people want to disappear, they don't choose the most obvious wizard pub in London. Harry turned to find Daphne Greengrass standing beside his table, her blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, and her Slytherin scarf draped elegantly over her school robes. She looked as composed as she always did in the halls of Hogwarts, but there was something different in her pale blue eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there during their brief classroom interactions. Greengrass, Harry said, surprised. What are you doing here? Looking for you, obviously. She slid into the chair across from him, without invitation, setting a small leather satchel on the table between them. Though I admit, I expected you to be more creative in your choice of hiding spots. I'm not hiding, Harry protested, though even as he said it, he realized how unconvincing it sounded, given his corner table and wary glances at the other patrons. No? Daphne's smile was faint, but unmistakably amused. Then what would you call leaving Hogwarts in the middle of the night and ending up at the leaky cauldron before most people have finished breakfast? Harry studied her face, looking for signs of mockery or the sort of cruel amusement he'd come to expect from Slytherins. Instead, he found something that looked almost like respect. "How did you even know I was here?" he asked. "Lucky guess. Though really, Potter, where else would an 11-year-old wizard go when he needs somewhere to think? The Leaky Cauldron is the only place in magical London that asks no questions and takes no sides." She gestured to Tom, who was studiously ignoring their conversation while polishing glasses. "Besides, I've been watching you since term started. You always choose places where you can see the exits." That observation was uncomfortably accurate. Harry had indeed positioned himself where he could see both the main entrance and the passage to Diagon Alley, old habits from the Dursleys, where escape routes had sometimes meant the difference between a peaceful evening and Uncle Vernon's belt. "You've been watching me," Harry said flatly. "Don't say it like that. I'm not some sort of stalker." Daphne's cheeks coloured slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. "I meant observing. You're interesting. Because I'm famous. Because you're not what I expected." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Do you know what my parents told me when my Hogwarts letter arrived? They said Harry Potter would be the most important person in my year, possibly in my lifetime. They said I should cultivate a friendship with you, because allying with the boy who lived would secure our family's future for generations." Harry's stomach twisted. Another person who saw him as a political opportunity, rather than just Harry. Daphne must have seen something in his expression, because she held up a hand. "But that's not why I'm here, Potter." "Well, not exactly." "Then why?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers toying with the clasp of her satchel. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its usual cool confidence. "Because after 3 months of watching you, I realized my parents were wrong. You're not the most important person in our year, because you're the boy who lived. You're important because you're the only one of us who doesn't seem to care about any of that. You sit with a blood traitor and a muggle-born at meals. You helped Longbottom when Malfoy was hexing him, even though it wasn't your business. You've never once used your fame to get special treatment or make others do what you want." Harry shifted uncomfortably. That's just being decent." "Exactly." Daphne's smile was genuine now, transforming her entire face. "Do you have any idea how rare that is among pure-blood children? How unusual it is for someone with your power and status to choose kindness over advancement?" "I'm not that special," Harry muttered. "You left Hogwarts, Potter. You walked away from the most prestigious magical education in Britain because you discovered something that violated your principles. Most people would have found ways to rationalize it, to convince themselves that whatever upset them wasn't really that important. But you didn't. You acted." There was something in her voice, admiration, but also something deeper, as if his departure had confirmed something she'd been hoping to see. "How did you know I left because of principles?" Harry asked. "The whole school probably thinks I just couldn't handle the pressure." "Because I know you." Daphne opened her satchel and withdrew a small, leather-bound journal. "I've been keeping notes since September. Not in a creepy way," she added hastily, seeing his expression. "Just observations. About how you react to things, what seems to matter to you, what doesn't." She flipped through pages covered in neat, precise handwriting. October 12th. Potter intervened when Flint was bullying a second-year Hufflepuff, despite Flint being 3 years older and twice his size. October 23rd. Declined invitation to join the Slug Club because he said he didn't want special treatment. November 8th. Spent his free period helping Longbottom practice transfiguration, instead of playing Quidditch with his friends. "You really have been stalking me," Harry said, but there was no real accusation in his voice. He was too fascinated by the idea that someone had been paying such careful attention to who he was rather than what he represented. "I prefer researching," Daphne replied primly. "And it's paid off because I know something the adults don't. They're all going to try to win you over with wealth and power and political connections. But that's not what you want, is it?" Harry shook his head slowly. "I just want to be left alone to make my own choices." "Exactly. Which is why my family's offer is going to be different from all the others." "Your family's offer?" Daphne leaned back in her chair, and suddenly Harry could see the pure-blood aristocrat she'd been raised to be. "The Greengrass family has been researching magical protections for decades, Potter. We know more about blood wards, family magic, and protective enchantments than almost anyone in Britain. What we're prepared to offer you isn't wealth or political power. It's knowledge and freedom. Freedom. My father has been studying the protections your mother placed on you when she died. We think we've found a way to replicate them without requiring you to live with relatives who treat you badly." Daphne's voice dropped even lower. "We can offer you the same magical protection you had at Privet Drive, but in a place where you'll be treated as family, not as an unwanted burden." Harry's heart began beating faster. "That's possible. We think so, but it would require a formal alliance between our families. Not adoption, but something more like a mutual protection pact. You would become a ward of the Greengrass family, with all the protections that entails, and in return, I become a political asset for your family," Harry finished, his brief hope deflating. "In return, you help us restore the balance in pure-blood politics," Daphne corrected. "Not all pure-blood families are like the Malfoys, Potter. Some of us believe in maintaining our traditions without oppressing others. Some of us think the wizarding world needs leaders who understand that power comes with responsibility, not the right to dominate." She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, a gesture so surprising that Harry almost jerked away. Her fingers were warm and steadier than his own. "We're not asking you to be our puppet. We're asking you to be our ally. To learn about the political world you're already part of, whether you want to be or not, and then make informed decisions about how to use your influence." Harry stared down at their joined hands, his mind racing. It sounded too good to be true. Protection without manipulation, alliance without servitude. But Daphne was 11, the same age as him. How could she possibly understand the complexities she was describing? As if reading his thoughts, she squeezed his fingers and released them. "I know what you're thinking. I'm just a first year, same as you. But I've been raised for this, Potter. Pure-blood children learn politics the way Muggle children learn to read, and I've had 3 months to think about what it would mean to have Harry Potter as a genuine ally instead of a reluctant celebrity." The leather satchel rustled as she withdrew a sealed envelope bearing an elaborate family crest, a silver phoenix rising from green flames. "This is a formal proposal from my father, Lord Cyrus Greengrass. Full magical protections, private tutoring in subjects Hogwarts doesn't teach, and a voice in family decisions that affect the wizarding world's future. No contracts that bind you against your will. No promises you can't break if you change your mind." Harry took the envelope, surprised by its weight. The parchment felt expensive beneath his fingers, and the wax seal still warm as if it had been charmed to maintain the temperature of the hands that had sealed it. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why me, and why now?" Daphne's smile was soft and almost shy, the first expression he'd seen from her that reminded him she was really just 11 years old. "Because 3 months ago, I watched the Sorting Hat deliberate over you for longer than anyone in living memory. And when it finally placed you in Gryffindor, you looked relieved. Not proud or excited or vindicated, just relieved. like you'd been afraid it would send you somewhere you didn't belong. She stood, shouldering her satchel with practiced elegance. Most people would have been thrilled to be chosen by their house. You just looked grateful to have a place at all. That's when I knew my parents were right about you being important, but for all the wrong reasons. "Daphne," Harry said, as she turned to leave. She looked back, eyebrows raised. "Thank you for seeing me," instead of just seeing the boy who lived. Her smile could have lit the entire pub. "You're welcome, Harry Potter, though if you accept our offer, you'll find that being seen can sometimes be more challenging than being overlooked." She was nearly to the door when it burst open, admitting a younger girl who looked remarkably like Daphne, but with darker hair and eyes that sparkled with barely contained excitement. "Daphne!" the girl called, loud enough to draw stares from the other patrons. "Father sent me to find you. The Malfoys have sent their proposal, and the Longbottoms are requesting a meeting and—" She stopped abruptly, her gaze falling on Harry. "Oh, you found him." "Astoria," Daphne said, in the tone of an older sister, addressing a particularly trying, younger sibling. "Perhaps you could try to be a bit less obvious." But Astoria Greengrass was already approaching Harry's table, her young face bright with curiosity. "You're really him, aren't you? Harry Potter, the one who left Hogwarts." "Astoria," Daphne warned. "What? It's brilliant." Astoria turned back to Harry, her eyes shining with admiration. "No one's ever just walked away from Dumbledore before. Everyone's talking about it. Father says you've got more courage than half the auras at the Ministry." Harry found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. There was something refreshing about Astoria's direct approach after months of people either fearing him or wanting something from him. It didn't feel particularly courageous, he admitted. Mostly it felt terrifying. "The best choices usually do," Astoria said wisely, with the sort of profound observation that only children seemed capable of making. "That's what Father always says anyway." Daphne moved to her sister's side, resting a protective hand on the younger girl's shoulder. "Speaking of Father, he's waiting for your answer, Potter. Not today, obviously. This is too important a decision to rush. But soon. Other families are already making their moves, and some of them—" She glanced meaningfully at her sister. "Some of them won't be as patient or as principled as we are." Harry nodded, tucking the sealed envelope into his jacket pocket alongside Fawkes's feather and his wand. The weight of choices, real choices, made freely instead of having them made for him, settled around his shoulders like a mantle. "I'll read your father's proposal carefully," he promised. "Good." Daphne's smile was approving. "And Harry, whatever you decide, I'm glad I was right about you." As the Greengrass sisters disappeared into the crowd of Diagon Alley, Harry sat back in his chair and pulled out the envelope. The wax seal felt warm and solid under his thumb, waiting to reveal whatever lay inside. For the first time since leaving Hogwarts, Harry Potter felt something that might have been hope. Chapter 5. The Malfoy Counteroffer. The white peacock that landed on Harry's table at the Leaky Cauldron drew every eye in the establishment. Even Tom the barkeeper stopped mid-conversation to stare as the magnificent bird preened its feathers and extended one leg, revealing a scroll tied with silver ribbon that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. Harry had been nursing his second cup of hot chocolate while reading through Lord Greengrass's formal proposal, a document filled with careful legal language about magical protections and family alliances that made his head spin. The peacock's arrival provided a welcome distraction, though he couldn't help but notice the way other patrons suddenly found excuses to look in his direction. The scroll was heavier than he'd expected, and the moment his fingers touched the silver ribbon, he felt the unmistakable tingle of magic. When he unrolled the parchment, elegant script appeared as if written by an invisible hand. "Master Harry Potter, the Malfoy family cordially requests the honor of your presence at Malfoy Manor for dinner this evening at 7 o'clock. A carriage will collect you from the leaky cauldron at 6:30. We believe you will find our conversation illuminating. Most respectfully yours, Lord Lucius Malfoy, head of the ancient and noble house of Malfoy. Harry stared at the invitation, his stomach doing uncomfortable somersaults. The Malfoys. Even after only 3 months at Hogwarts, he knew enough about wizarding politics to understand what this meant. Lucius Malfoy was one of the most powerful, pure-blood lords in Britain, a man whose influence reached deep into the Ministry of Magic and whose family name commanded both respect and fear. And Draco Malfoy was the boy who'd called Hermione a mudblood and sneered at Ron's worn robes. Impressive stationery. Harry looked up to find a familiar blonde head approaching his table, though this time Draco Malfoy's usual sneer was notably absent. Instead, the Slytherin boy looked almost nervous. Malfoy, Harry said carefully. Aren't you supposed to be at Hogwarts? Family emergency, Draco replied, sliding uninvited into the chair Daphne had vacated earlier. Father called me home the moment he heard about your departure. And what exactly did your father want to discuss with you about my departure? Draco shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his pale eyes avoiding Harry's gaze. Look, Potter, before you meet with my parents tonight. Who says I'm meeting with your parents? You're holding their invitation, and you haven't thrown it away or set it on fire. That suggests you're at least considering it. Draco leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something before you go to the manor. About things I've said. Things I've done. Harry raised an eyebrow. Draco Malfoy apologizing was not something he'd expected to witness in this lifetime. My father, Draco continued, clearly struggling with each word. He has very specific ideas about how pure-blood children should behave, about who we should associate with, how we should treat others, what we should believe about blood status and family honor. And I've been following those ideas because I thought they were right, because I wanted to make him proud. Draco's voice cracked slightly, reminding Harry that, despite his aristocratic manner, Malfoy was still just 11 years old. But after what happened with the troll on Halloween, Harry remembered that night vividly. Hermione had been crying in the girls' bathroom when the mountain troll had wandered in, and Harry and Ron had rushed to help her. They'd nearly been killed before managing to knock the creature unconscious, but it had been worth it to see Hermione safe. What about the troll? I was there, Potter, in the corridor outside. I saw you and Weasley run toward danger to save Granger, even though she's... Draco stopped himself, his face flushing. Even though Father would say she's not worth risking your lives for. But you think she is? Draco was quiet for a long moment. I think, he said finally, that watching someone risk their life for a friend, regardless of that friend's blood status, makes it very difficult to believe that blood status is what determines a person's worth. The admission seemed to cost him considerable effort. Harry found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about Draco Malfoy. So why are you telling me this? Because my father is going to try to recruit you tonight. He's going to offer you things, power, wealth, political connections, that most wizards could only dream of. And he's going to expect me to help convince you by pretending to be your friend. Draco met Harry's eyes directly for the first time in the conversation. I wanted you to know that if I'm friendly tonight, it's not because Father ordered me to be. It's because I think I might have been wrong about you from the beginning. Harry studied Draco's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. All he saw was an 11-year-old boy who looked deeply uncomfortable but determined to do something he believed was right. Thank you, Harry said finally, for the warning. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen what my father can offer. At precisely 6:30, a carriage unlike anything Harry had ever seen rolled to a stop in front of the leaky cauldron. It was drawn by 2 winged horses that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight, and the carriage itself looked like something from a fairy tale, all black lacquer and silver fittings that gleamed in the evening lamplight. The ride to Malfoy Manor passed in relative silence. Draco sat across from Harry, fidgeting with his sleeve cuffs and occasionally opening his mouth as if to speak before thinking better of it. Harry spent the journey staring out the window at the countryside flowing past, trying to prepare himself for whatever lay ahead. Malfoy Manor took his breath away. The estate sprawled across what seemed like miles of perfectly manicured grounds, with the main house rising like a palace from the center of it all. Every window blazed with warm golden light, and peacocks wandered the lawns like living decorations. It was beautiful in a way that spoke of centuries of wealth and power, but also somehow cold, as if all that beauty existed more for display than for comfort. Lucius Malfoy waited for them in the entrance hall, and Harry understood immediately where Draco had inherited his aristocratic bearing. The man was tall and elegant, with the same pale hair as his son, and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His robes were clearly expensive, cut from silk that probably cost more than the Dursleys spent on food in a year. "Master Potter," Lucius said, his voice cultured and smooth. "Welcome to Malfoy Manor. We are honored by your presence." The formal greeting felt strange coming from someone who was technically speaking to an 11-year-old, but Harry found himself responding in kind. "Thank you for the invitation, Lord Malfoy." "Please, simply Lucius will suffice. We are, after all, going to be discussing matters of mutual benefit." Lucius's smile was warm, but somehow never quite reached his eyes. "Come, let us retire to my study before dinner. I believe you'll find our conversation educational." The study was a monument to power and influence. The walls were lined with books that looked ancient and valuable, interspersed with portraits of stern-faced wizards who Harry assumed were previous Malfoy patriarchs. A massive desk dominated one corner, its surface covered with correspondence bearing official ministry seals and what looked like legal documents. But what drew Harry's attention were the photographs arranged on a side table, dozens of them, showing Lucius Malfoy with various important-looking witches and wizards, ministers of magic, foreign ambassadors, the leaders of major wizarding institutions. In every picture, Lucius stood at the center, clearly respected and influential. "Impressive, isn't it?" Lucius said, noticing Harry's attention. 30 years of careful relationship building. The Malfoy family has connections throughout the wizarding world, Master Potter. Connections that could be of considerable benefit to someone in your unique position." "My position?" "As the most famous young wizard in Britain, recently freed from the constraints of Albus Dumbledore's guardianship." Lucius moved to stand beside Harry, his presence somehow both reassuring and slightly intimidating. "Tell me, what do you know of your family's political history?" Harry shrugged. "Not much. I only learned I was a wizard 3 months ago." "Of course. Another failing on Dumbledore's part." Lucius's voice carried just a hint of disapproval. "The Potter family, Master Potter, once held one of the most respected seats on the Wizengamot. Your grandfather, Fleamont Potter, was known throughout magical Britain as a voice of reason and justice. Your father, had he lived, would have inherited that seat and the considerable influence that comes with it. What happened to it? When your parents died and you were relocated to your Muggle relatives, Dumbledore convinced the Wizengamot to suspend the Potter seat indefinitely. For your protection, he claimed." Lucius's smile was sharp. "But seats suspended can be restored, Master Potter, with the right backing and the proper legal arguments." Harry felt something stir in his chest, not quite excitement, but a kind of recognition. A seat on the Wizengamot would mean a voice in how the wizarding world was governed, a chance to actually influence decisions rather than simply being affected by them. What would restoring the seat require? A formal petition to the Wizengamot, backed by at least 3 established families of good standing. Lucius moved to his desk and withdrew a thick folder. I have already secured preliminary agreements from the Knott and Avery families. With Malfoy backing, your restoration would be virtually guaranteed. And in return, partnership, Master Potter. Not servitude, not adoption, but a true alliance between our families. The Malfoys would provide you with political education, financial resources, and protection from those who might seek to use your fame for their own ends. In return, you would lend the considerable weight of the Potter name to causes we both believe in. It sounded reasonable, even generous. But Harry couldn't forget Draco's warning about strings attached. What kind of causes? Lucius's expression grew thoughtful. The preservation of wizarding traditions, the maintenance of proper magical governance, the protection of pure blood families from increasing ministry oversight. His voice took on a persuasive quality. You see, Master Potter, the wizarding world is changing, and not always for the better. There are those who would see our ancient traditions abandoned in favor of progressive ideas that threaten the very foundations of magical society. Something in the way Lucius said, progressive ideas, made Harry's skin crawl, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. I'm not sure I understand. Of course not. You've been raised among muggles, deprived of proper magical education. Lucius moved closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. Tell me, what do you think of your friend, Miss Granger? Hermione? She's brilliant. Best in our year at almost everything. Indeed. But did you know that her academic success has created resentment among some pure blood families? That there are those who believe positions at prestigious institutions should be reserved for children of proper wizarding heritage? Harry felt a chill run down his spine. You mean because she's muggle-born? I mean because she lacks the cultural understanding that comes from being raised in a magical household. Lucius's correction felt somehow more dangerous than outright bigotry. It's not about blood purity in the crude sense, Master Potter. It's about preserving the knowledge and traditions that make wizarding society unique. And what does that have to do with me? Everything. Lucius returned to his desk and pulled out another document. With your influence, we could ensure that scholarships and positions go to deserving students who truly understand wizarding culture. We could protect families like the Weasleys from financial hardship while maintaining the proper order of things. We could create a world where everyone has their place and everyone is content with it. Harry stared at the document, some sort of political platform that used careful language to hide what sounded suspiciously like discrimination. His conversation with Daphne earlier came back to him, her words about families who wanted to maintain traditions without oppressing others. This didn't sound like that at all. I need to think about it, Harry said carefully. Of course, such important decisions shouldn't be made hastily. Lucius smiled, but there was something predatory in the expression. Perhaps dinner will help clarify matters. Narcissa is eager to meet you, and I believe you'll find her perspective illuminating. Dinner at Malfoy Manor was an education in pure blood extravagance. The dining room could have seated 30 people comfortably, with a table that seemed to be carved from a single piece of mahogany and place settings that probably cost more than most families' yearly income. House elves appeared and disappeared with courses that looked like works of art, and the conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine that Lucius sipped, while Harry stuck to pumpkin juice. Narcissa Malfoy was beautiful in the way that aristocratic women often were, perfectly presented, elegantly dressed, and carrying herself with the kind of poise that spoke of generations of careful breeding. But her eyes, Harry noticed, were sharper than her husband's, and she seemed to be evaluating him with every glance. So, Master Potter, she said, during a lull in the conversation, Draco tells us you're quite the Quidditch player. Perhaps you'd like to see our family's collection of racing brooms after dinner. That would be nice, thank you. Excellent. Draco, why don't you show Master Potter the estate while your father and I discuss some tedious business matters? It was clearly a dismissal, and Harry found himself following Draco out of the dining room and into a corridor lined with portraits that seemed to track their movement with disapproving eyes. "Your house is impressive," Harry said as they walked. "It's been in my family for centuries." Draco's voice carried the automatic pride of pure blood inheritance, but there was something else there too, something that might have been weariness. "Sometimes I think the portraits know more about being a Malfoy than I do." They ended up in what Draco called the broom collection room, though it looked more like a museum exhibit. Dozens of racing brooms hung in climate-controlled cases, each one representing a different era of Quidditch history. Some looked ancient enough to have been used by the sport's founders. "Harry," Draco said suddenly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "has my mother spoken to you privately yet?" "No. Why?" "She will, before you leave." Draco glanced around, as if checking for listening ears. "When she does, pay attention to what she doesn't say as much as what she does." "What do you mean?" "I mean that my mother loves me, and she's not always willing to let Father's political ambitions override what's best for our family, or for people she thinks deserve protection." Before Harry could ask for clarification, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, and Narcissa Malfoy appeared in the doorway. "Draco, dear, your father would like to speak with you about your transfiguration grades. Master Potter, would you mind accompanying me for a brief walk in the gardens? The evening air is quite lovely." The gardens of Malfoy Manor were as perfectly arranged as everything else on the estate, with geometric patterns of hedge and flower beds that looked like they'd been designed by an artist. Narcissa led Harry along a path lit by floating lanterns, her pace unhurried and her manner deceptively casual. "Tell me, Master Potter," she said as they walked, "what did you think of my husband's proposal?" "It's generous," Harry replied carefully. "Generous. Yes, Lucius is always generous when he wants something badly enough." She paused beside a fountain where marble peacocks seemed to dance in the moonlight. "But I wonder if you understood what he was truly offering. Political education and backing for my family's Wizengamot seat." "And the cost of that backing?" Harry studied her face, trying to read the expression hidden behind her aristocratic composure. He said it would be a partnership. "Indeed, a partnership where you provide legitimacy to policies that you may not fully understand, in exchange for power that comes with very specific expectations about how it should be used." Narcissa's smile was small and sad. "My husband is a good man, Master Potter, but he sometimes forgets that true power comes from being respected rather than feared." "I don't understand." "Let me be very clear, then." She turned to face him fully, her blue eyes intense in the lantern light. "The Malfoy family has many virtues: wealth, influence, political connections that span decades. But we also have obligations to certain ideologies, certain expectations, certain people whose friendship comes with a price." "What kind of price?" Narcissa was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "The kind that asks you to look the other way when friends make choices you don't agree with. The kind that requires you to support policies that benefit your allies, regardless of who else they might harm. The kind that makes it very difficult to say no, even when saying yes conflicts with your conscience." Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. "You're warning me away from your husband's offer. I'm ensuring you understand what you would be accepting." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, the gesture surprisingly motherly. "You remind me of someone I once knew, someone who had the courage to make difficult choices, even when those choices cost him everything." "Who?" "A young man who believed that doing what was right mattered more than doing what was expected. A young man who died because he refused to compromise his principles." Her voice carried a weight of old grief. "I would hate to see you forced to make the same choice between your conscience and your safety." They walked back to the manor in silence, and Harry found himself thinking about the difference between Narcissa's warning and Daphne's offer. Both women were concerned about his welfare, But where Daphne had offered him agency and choice, Narcissa seemed to be suggesting that accepting her family's protection would inevitably compromise his ability to choose freely. As the winged horses pulled his carriage back toward London, Harry stared out at the countryside and tried to make sense of what he'd experienced. Lucius Malfoy's offer was seductive. Wealth, power, influence, the restoration of his family's political position. But Narcissa's warning echoed in his mind, along with Draco's awkward apology and admission that watching Harry risk himself for Hermione had changed how he saw blood purity. By the time the leaky cauldron came back into view, Harry had made a decision about the Malfoy proposal. It was generous, it was tempting, and it was absolutely not what he wanted for his future. Chapter 6. The Black Family Revelation. Harry had just settled back into his corner table at the leaky cauldron when the woman approached. She moved with quiet confidence through the evening crowd, and something about her bearing reminded him immediately of Narcissa Malfoy. The same aristocratic grace, the same way of holding herself that spoke of pure blood breeding. But where Narcissa's beauty was cold and perfect, this woman had warmth in her dark eyes and silver threads in her brown hair that suggested hard-won wisdom. She stopped beside his table and smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "Harry Potter, I presume?" "Yes," Harry said cautiously. After his experience at Malfoy Manor, he was wary of any adult who approached him with that particular combination of knowledge and purpose. "My name is Andromeda Tonks," she said, settling into the chair across from him, without invitation, but somehow without presumption either. "I believe we have quite a lot to discuss." The name sparked recognition. Narcissa had mentioned an Andromeda earlier, hadn't she? Something about her sister and complications. "You're related to Narcissa Malfoy," Harry said. Andromeda's smile grew rueful. "I am indeed. We're sisters, though we haven't spoken in over a decade. I made choices that the Black family found unacceptable." She gestured to herself, dressed in simple but well-tailored robes that spoke of middle-class comfort rather than pure blood wealth. "I married a Muggle-born, you see. Ted Tonks. Wonderful man. Terrible at magic. Brilliant with anything that has gears or circuits. They disowned you for that? Burned my name right off the family tapestry." Andromeda's voice carried old hurt, but no bitterness. "The Black family has very particular ideas about blood purity, though I suspect recent events have some of them reconsidering those positions." She reached into a leather satchel and withdrew a rolled parchment that looked ancient and carefully preserved. "But I'm not here to discuss my family's failings, Harry. I'm here because you have connections to the Black family that you don't even know about, and given your current situation, I think it's time you learned the truth." Harry felt a familiar chill run down his spine. "What kind of connections?" "The kind that make you family." Andromeda unrolled the parchment, revealing an intricate family tree that seemed to shimmer with magical preservation charms. Names branched and connected in gold script, with dates of birth, marriage, and death carefully noted beside each entry. "This is the Black family genealogy, going back over 1,000 years. Every pure-blood family in Britain appears on this tree somewhere, through marriage or adoption or magical contract." She traced a line with her finger, following it through generations until she stopped at a name that made Harry's breath catch. Dorea Black Potter, 1920 to 1977. "Your grandmother, Harry, your father's mother. She was a Black before she married Charles Potter." Andromeda's finger moved to show the connection, "which makes you, through blood and magic both, part of the Black family legacy." Harry stared at the name, trying to process what he was seeing. "My father never mentioned. Your father likely didn't think much about it. The Potters were always more interested in what people did than who their ancestors were." Andromeda's expression grew sad. "But blood magic doesn't care about personal preferences, Harry. You carry Black family magic in your veins, which gives you certain rights and protections that you've never known about. What kind of rights? Instead of answering immediately, Andromeda reached back into her satchel and withdrew a thick folder of official-looking documents. Before we discuss rights, we need to discuss responsibilities. And to do that, I need to tell you about your godfather. Harry's head snapped up. I have a godfather? You do. Though I suspect Albus Dumbledore has been very careful not to mention that fact. Andromeda's voice carried a sharp edge of anger that reminded Harry uncomfortably of the way Narcissa had spoken about Dumbledore's failures. Your godfather is my cousin, Sirius Black. The name hit Harry like a physical blow. Everyone in the wizarding world knew about Sirius Black, the mass murderer who'd escaped Azkaban prison, the dangerous criminal who'd betrayed Harry's parents to Voldemort, the madman who'd killed 13 people with a single curse. That's impossible, Harry whispered. I know how it sounds. I know what the official records say, what the newspapers reported, what everyone believes about what happened that night. Andromeda leaned forward, her dark eyes intense with conviction. But Harry, I also know my cousin. I know what kind of man Sirius Black really is, and I know he would have died before betraying James and Lily Potter. But the evidence was manufactured. Andromeda opened the folder and withdrew a collection of documents that made Harry's eyes widen. These are copies of the original Aura investigation records, obtained through very careful use of legal channels and family connections. Do you know what they show? Harry shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. They show that Sirius Black was never given a trial. Not a full trial, not even a hearing. He was found at the scene where Peter Pettigrew died, accused of being the secret keeper who betrayed your parents' location, and sent directly to Azkaban. Andromeda's voice grew harder with each word. No veritaserum testimony, no examination of the evidence, no investigation into whether the secret keeper might have been someone else entirely. But if he wasn't the secret keeper, then someone else betrayed your parents, and that someone has been living free for the past 10 years while an innocent man rots in the worst prison in the wizarding world. Andromeda spread the documents across the table, pointing to specific passages with a trembling finger. Look at this witness testimony. 3 people saw Sirius cornering Peter Pettigrew in that street, heard him shouting about betrayal and lies. But the official report claims Sirius was the one doing the betraying. Harry studied the documents, his mind racing. The handwriting was official, the magical seals authentic, and the dates all corresponded to the days immediately following his parents' death. Why didn't anyone question it at the time? Because Sirius was a Black, and the Black family had a reputation for dark arts and Death Eater sympathies. Because Peter Pettigrew was considered a war hero, your father's friend, a member of the Order of the Phoenix. Because it was easier to believe that the troubled, pure-blood heir had gone dark than to investigate whether the sweet, bumbling little man might have been playing a deeper game. Andromeda's voice carried years of frustration and grief. And because Albus Dumbledore, who could have demanded a proper investigation, chose not to. The last piece hit Harry like a physical blow. Dumbledore knew. Dumbledore was Sirius's official magical guardian after my uncle Orion died. He had the legal right to demand a trial, to insist on proper evidence, to ensure that his ward received justice. Andromeda's expression grew grim. He chose instead to let the ministry handle things quietly. No messy trials, no uncomfortable questions about how the Order of the Phoenix had been infiltrated, no investigation that might reveal inconvenient truths about other people's loyalties. Harry felt sick. Another manipulation, another decision made for reasons that had nothing to do with justice or truth and everything to do with Dumbledore's version of the greater good. Where is he now? Harry asked quietly. Still in Azkaban, still insane from 10 years of Dementors, still convinced that everyone he loved is dead because of his failures. Andromeda's voice broke slightly. Still believing that he failed to protect you, when the truth is that he's been punished for someone else's crime. The pub around them seemed to fade into background noise as Harry absorbed the magnitude of what he was learning. Not only did he have a godfather, but that godfather was innocent, had been innocent all along, and was suffering in prison while his parents, real betrayer, walked free. "There's more," Andromeda said gently. "The Black family properties. As Sirius's heir, and you are his heir, both through blood connection and godfather rights, you have legal claim to the Black family estate." "I don't want their money." "It's not just money, Harry. It's sanctuary." Andromeda pulled out another document, this one bearing several official seals. Number 12, Grimmauld Place, in London. It's been the Black family seat for centuries, and it's protected by wards and concealment charms that make it virtually invisible to anyone who doesn't have family blood or specific permission to enter. Harry looked up from the documents, meeting her eyes directly. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want in return?" Andromeda was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I want my cousin to have a chance at justice. I want my family's name to mean something other than shame and dark arts. And I want you to have choices that aren't controlled by Albus Dumbledore or any other adult who thinks they know what's best for you. But there's more than that, isn't there?" She smiled, and for the first time since sitting down, she looked truly happy. "There is indeed. I have a daughter, Harry. Nymphadora, though she'll hex anyone who uses her first name. She's 19, just graduated from Hogwarts, and she's training to be an Auror. What does she have to do with this? She's been following your case since you left Hogwarts this morning. Not officially, of course. She's just a trainee, and this isn't technically Auror business. But she has strong opinions about justice and protecting people who can't protect themselves." Andromeda's pride in her daughter was obvious. "She also has certain abilities that would make her an excellent guardian for someone who might need protection from people with less noble intentions." Before Harry could ask what kind of abilities, the chair beside him scraped against the floor, and a young woman slid into the seat with easy familiarity. She had bright pink hair that seemed to shimmer with its own light, and her face shifted slightly as Harry watched, nose narrowing, cheekbones sharpening, ears becoming slightly pointed. "Watch her, Harry," she said, her voice carrying a cheerful energy that immediately made him feel more at ease. "I'm Tonks, and before you ask, yes, I'm a metamorphmagus, and yes, that means I can look like practically anyone I want to." Harry stared as her hair shifted from pink to purple to bright green. "That's incredible. It's useful," she said with a grin, "especially for keeping certain pure-blood families from recognizing me when I need to keep an eye on their activities. Amazing what you can learn when people think you're just another face in the crowd." "Nymphadora has been monitoring the various family responses to your departure from Hogwarts," Andromeda explained. "She thought you should know what some of them are really planning." "Such as?" Tonks's expression grew serious, her hair settling into a more natural brown color. "Such as the fact that the Malfoys aren't the only family planning to use your political influence for their own ends. The Knots want to position you as a figurehead for their pure blood preservation initiatives. The Averys are hoping to use your fame to legitimize some very nasty legislation they've been trying to push through the Wizengamot for years. And the families presenting themselves as the light alternative? Better intentions, maybe, but just as controlling in their own way." Tonks leaned back in her chair, her posture casual, but her eyes sharp with intelligence. "Augusta Longbottom wants to mold you into the perfect order of the Phoenix member. The Bones family sees you as a way to advance Amelia's political career. Even some of the more liberal purebloods are looking at you and seeing opportunity rather than a person." Harry felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. "So everyone wants to use me for something." "Not everyone," Andromeda said quietly. The Black family wants to give you something. A place that's truly yours, protected by magic older than most of the families trying to court you. No political obligations, no strings attached. Just sanctuary and family, and the chance to make your own choices about what comes next. In exchange for what? Nothing, Tonks said firmly. Well, except maybe letting me teach you some proper defensive magic. The stuff they teach at Hogwarts is rubbish for actual protection, and if you're going to be making enemies of powerful pure-blood families, you'll need to know how to take care of yourself. Harry looked between the two women, the disowned Black daughter who had sacrificed her family's wealth and status for love, and the young Auror who seemed genuinely interested in his welfare rather than his fame. For the first time since leaving Hogwarts, he felt like he might have found adults who actually saw him as a person rather than a symbol. When could I see this place? He asked. Grimmauld Place? Andromeda's smile was brilliant. Right now, if you'd like. It's not far, and the wards will recognize your blood. Once you're officially acknowledged as heir, you'll be able to modify the protections however you see fit. And Sirius? We'll have to wait for justice, I'm afraid. Getting an innocent man out of Azkaban requires more legal maneuvering than we can manage overnight. But Harry... Andromeda reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Having his godson fighting for his freedom will give Sirius something to hope for. Something to stay sane for. And that might be the most important gift you could give him. As they gathered the documents and prepared to leave the leaky cauldron, Harry felt something shift inside him. For the first time since learning he was a wizard, he was being offered not just shelter or education or political opportunity, but family. Real family, with all the messy complications and fierce loyalties that entailed. It felt like coming home to a place he'd never seen before. One more thing, Tonks said, as they stood to leave. The house might be a bit unusual. It's been closed up for years, and the Black family had some interesting ideas about home decoration. Don't take any of it personally, yeah? Harry nodded, shouldering his trunk and following the two women out into the London night. Behind them, the leaky cauldron continued its evening business, unaware that the most famous wizard in Britain had just discovered he had family willing to fight for him rather than use him. For once, that felt like enough. Chapter 7. The Ministry's panic Minister Cornelius Fudge had been enjoying what he'd hoped would be a quiet morning in his office when the flu network began exploding with calls. The first had been from Lucius Malfoy, requesting an urgent audience about matters of national importance. The second had come from Augusta Longbottom, demanding immediate clarification of certain irregularities in child welfare procedures. By the time Amelia Bones's head appeared in his fireplace, with a grim expression and a request for emergency legal consultations, Fudge had realized that his quiet morning was about to become a political nightmare. "Minister," said his secretary, poking her head through the office door with barely concealed panic, "Lords Knott, Avery, and Selwyn are all requesting immediate meetings. The Greengrass family has sent formal correspondence, marked, 'Urgent governmental review required.' And, sir, the Daily Prophet's editor has been trying to reach you for the past hour." Fudge sat back in his chair, his bowler hat askew and his hands already beginning to tremble with the nervous energy that had plagued him since taking office 13 months ago. The Ministry of Magic was still recovering from the chaos of the war's aftermath, and his position as minister depended heavily on maintaining stable relationships with the major pure-blood families. If they were all suddenly demanding meetings about the same issue. "What exactly has happened?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Harry Potter has withdrawn from Hogwarts School, sir. Left sometime yesterday morning, according to the reports we're receiving. Professor McGonagall filed the official notification with the Department of Magical Education, but apparently..." The secretary consulted her notes nervously. Apparently, several families have already made contact with him directly. Fudge felt his stomach drop to somewhere around his ankles. Harry Potter, The boy who lived, the most famous wizard in Britain, the child whose survival had symbolized the wizarding world's victory over darkness, had walked away from Dumbledore's protection and into the political arena, where every move would be scrutinized, analyzed, and potentially exploited. "Get me Kingsley Shacklebolt," Fudge said, reaching for his emergency supply of antacid tablets, "and schedule an immediate meeting with Amelia Bones. Cancel everything else for the morning." 20 minutes later, Fudge sat across from Amelia Bones in the secure conference room adjacent to his office, with Auror Shacklebolt standing at attention nearby. The head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had brought a thick folder of documents, and her expression suggested that whatever she'd discovered was deeply troubling. "Minister," she began without preamble, "we have a significant problem. Multiple pure-blood families have contacted the Ministry this morning, claiming legal standing to offer guardianship or protection to Harry Potter. The Malfoys are asserting traditional pure-blood alliance rights. The Longbottoms are citing war orphan protection statutes. The Greengrass family has submitted a formal petition for magical contract enforcement. And legally they have grounds for these claims? That's complicated." Amelia opened her folder and withdrew several official documents. The placement of Harry Potter with his Muggle relatives was never formally reviewed by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Albus Dumbledore presented the arrangement to the then minister as a temporary protective measure, but it was never subjected to standard child welfare evaluations or legal oversight. Fudge felt his headache intensifying. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning that if any family can demonstrate that Potter's current guardianship arrangement fails to meet minimum standards for magical child welfare, they may have grounds to petition for alternative arrangements. Amelia's voice was carefully neutral, but Fudge had worked with her long enough to recognize the signs of barely controlled anger. "And Minister, based on the preliminary information we've gathered about the boy's treatment by his Muggle relatives." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Fudge had heard rumors over the years, whispers in the corridors about Potter's thin frame when he'd arrived at Hogwarts, about his obvious unfamiliarity with even basic wizarding customs, about the way he'd seemed almost grateful for the simplest kindnesses. "You're saying Dumbledore may have placed the boy in an unsuitable environment?" "I'm saying that we have a legal and ethical obligation to investigate the circumstances of Potter's guardianship, particularly given his current vulnerable status." Amelia leaned forward, her expression intense. "But Minister, there's more. Several of the families making contact with Potter have questionable motivations. If we don't act quickly to ensure his welfare, we risk him falling under the influence of individuals whose political goals may not align with the broader interests of magical society." Before Fudge could respond, there was a soft knock at the conference room door. A young man with red hair and horn-rimmed spectacles peered in nervously. "Excuse me, Minister," said Percy Weasley, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone still learning to navigate ministry politics. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. There's been some unusual activity in the flu monitoring department." Fudge gestured for the young man to enter. Percy Weasley was in his 5th year at Hogwarts, but had been granted special permission to spend certain days at the ministry as part of an advanced governmental studies program. His reports were always thorough, and his discretion absolute, making him an invaluable source of information about both Hogwarts affairs and ministry operations. "What kind of activity, Mr. Weasley?" "The pure-blood family networks have been unusually active since yesterday evening, sir. Calls between the Malfoys, Knotts, Averys, and several other families, all coded with privacy charms, but all registered as urgent political consultations. And, sir," Percy glanced nervously at Amelia Bones before continuing, "my family received a message from my brother, Ron, this morning, about Harry Potter. And? Ron says Potter left letters explaining his departure, but they were vague. Something about discovering information that made continuing at Hogwarts impossible." My mother is quite concerned, sir. She's always been fond of Harry, and the idea that he might be alone and vulnerable to manipulation. Percy trailed off, but his meaning was clear. If Molly Weasley was concerned about Harry Potter's welfare, the situation was likely even more serious than the Ministry had initially realized. "Thank you, Mr. Weasley," Fudge said. "Please continue monitoring the flu networks and report any unusual patterns directly to me." After Percy had left, Kingsley Shacklebolt spoke for the first time since entering the conference room. "Minister, if I may?" His deep voice carried the calm authority that made him one of the Ministry's most trusted auras. "I've been reviewing the reports from Hogwarts, and there are some concerning inconsistencies." "Such as?" "Professor McGonagall's official notification states that Potter withdrew, citing fundamental breach of educational trust, but provides no details about what that breach might have entailed. However, several students report seeing Potter in what appeared to be serious distress the evening before his departure." Kingsley paused, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Additionally, there are reports that Potter spent considerable time in the library researching magical guardianship laws the night he left." Amelia's expression grew even more grim. "That suggests he didn't make his decision impulsively. He researched his legal options, which means he likely discovered something specific about his situation that motivated the withdrawal. The question," Fudge said slowly, "is what exactly he discovered, and whether it reflects poorly on the Ministry's oversight of his welfare." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. If Harry Potter had uncovered evidence of neglect or abuse in his placement with the Dursleys, and if that placement had been arranged without proper Ministry oversight, the political consequences could be devastating. The pureblood families would use any scandal to advance their own agendas. The press would have a field day with stories of governmental incompetence, and Fudge's own position as minister could be seriously threatened. "What do you recommend?" he asked finally. "Immediate action on multiple fronts," Amelia replied crisply. "First, I want a full investigation into the circumstances of Potter's placement with his relatives, including any documentation that may exist about Dumbledore's rationale for the arrangement. Second, we need to establish official contact with Potter to ensure his current safety and assess his needs. Third, we need to develop protocols for evaluating any guardianship petitions that may be submitted by interested families. And fourth," Kingsley added quietly, "we need to consider the possibility that Potter's departure from Hogwarts may have been justified, in which case our priority should be supporting his decision rather than trying to reverse it." Fudge stared at the aura, startled by the suggestion. "You think he made the right choice?" "I think," Kingsley said carefully, "that an 11-year-old child doesn't walk away from the most prestigious magical education in Britain without serious cause. And I think that if we respond to his decision by trying to override his agency, rather than investigating his concerns, we risk repeating whatever mistakes led to this situation in the first place." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive, and Fudge found himself reconsidering his initial assumption that the crisis could be resolved by simply convincing Potter to return to Hogwarts. "Very well," he said finally. "Amelia, I want that investigation started immediately. Kingsley, I want you to establish discreet contact with Potter, not to pressure him, but to assess his current circumstances and ensure his safety. And I want both of you to keep me informed of any developments that might affect Ministry policy or public perception." "What about the families making contact with him?" Amelia asked. "Monitor their activities closely, but don't interfere unless you have evidence of coercion or inappropriate pressure. If Potter is truly exercising his legal right to seek alternative arrangements, we have an obligation to ensure that process proceeds fairly." Fudge paused, considering his words carefully. "But make it clear to all interested parties that the Ministry will be taking an active interest in Potter's welfare, and that any attempts to exploit his situation for political gain will be viewed very dimly indeed." As the meeting concluded and his advisors departed to begin their respective investigations, Fudge remained in the conference room, staring out at the London skyline through the room's enchanted windows. Somewhere in the city below, the most famous wizard in Britain was making choices that could reshape the political landscape of magical society. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, Fudge found himself hoping that whatever Harry Potter decided to do, it would be based on his own genuine interests, rather than the machinations of adults who saw him as a means to their own ends. After all, the boy had already demonstrated more courage and independence than most wizards twice his age. Perhaps it was time for the magical government to show him the same respect. But first, they needed to understand exactly what had driven him to make such a drastic choice in the first place. Later that afternoon, Percy Weasley sat in a quiet corner of the ministry cafeteria, composing a careful letter to his family. The morning's revelations had left him with conflicting loyalties: his duty to the ministry, his concern for Harry Potter, and his awareness that his family would want to know everything he'd learned about their friend's situation. Dear Mother and Father, I wanted to update you on the situation with Harry, though I must ask you to treat this information with the discretion it deserves. The ministry is taking his departure from Hogwarts very seriously, and there are concerns that his treatment by his Muggle relatives may not have met appropriate standards. Minister Fudge has ordered a full investigation, and Aura Shacklebolt has been assigned to establish contact with Harry to ensure his safety. I cannot share all the details, but I can tell you that Harry appears to have made his decision after careful research and consideration. This was not a child's tantrum or impulsive rebellion, but a reasoned response to circumstances that may have been more serious than any of us realized. Please give my love to everyone, and tell Ron that his friend is not forgotten or abandoned. There are people working to ensure his welfare, even if they must do so carefully. Your son, Percy. As he sealed the letter and prepared to send it via Ministry Owl, Percy reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 3 years ago, he'd been just another Hogwarts student dreaming of a career in magical government. Now he found himself at the center of a political crisis that could define the future of the wizarding world. But perhaps that was appropriate. After all, his generation would be the one to live with the consequences of whatever decisions were made in the coming days. It seemed only fitting that they should have some voice in making them. The owl carrying his letter disappeared into the London evening, and Percy returned to his desk to continue monitoring the flu networks. Somewhere in the maze of political maneuvering and family ambitions, Harry Potter was trying to build a life for himself. Percy hoped, for everyone's sake, that the adults surrounding Harry would remember that the boy's welfare mattered more than their political games. But given what he'd observed of wizarding politics so far, he wasn't particularly optimistic. Chapter 8. The Weasley Dilemma. Harry had been sitting in the drawing room of Grimmauld Place for less than an hour when the ancient doorbell began its cacophonous ringing. The sound echoed through the narrow house like a death knell, followed immediately by the shrieking of Mrs. Black's portrait from the hallway below. Even with Tonks's warning about the house being unusual, Harry hadn't been prepared for the sheer malevolence that seemed to seep from the very walls of his newfound sanctuary. "I'll get it," Tonks called from somewhere deeper in the house, her voice carrying over the continued screaming. Probably more well-wishers wanting to discuss your brilliant life choices. But when the front door opened, the voices that drifted up the stairs weren't those of adults seeking political advantage. They were young, familiar, and absolutely furious. "Don't care what the portrait says, we're not leaving until we see him. Ron, please, let's try to be reasonable." Reasonable? He left, Hermione. He just left without saying goodbye, without explaining anything properly, and now we're supposed to be reasonable. Harry's stomach dropped as he recognized his friends' voices. He'd known this confrontation was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it quite so soon. The letters he'd left them had been deliberately vague. How could he explain that he'd discovered their beloved headmaster had orchestrated years of abuse in the name of character building? "Harry James Potter!" Hermione's voice rang out from the entrance hall below, sharp with the particular brand of anger that came from worry and hurt feelings. "We know you're here, so don't even think about hiding." With a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere around his shoes, Harry made his way down the narrow staircase. The hallway was exactly as unpleasant as Tonks had warned. Moth-eaten tapestries, disturbing portraits that muttered to themselves, and an overall atmosphere of malice that made his skin crawl. But standing in the middle of it all, looking utterly out of place in their Hogwarts uniforms, were Ron and Hermione. Ron's face was flushed red with anger, and his jaw was set in the stubborn expression Harry had come to associate with Weasley determination. Hermione looked as though she'd been crying, her bushy hair more unruly than usual, and her brown eyes bright with unshed tears. Both of them stared at him with expressions that somehow managed to combine relief at finding him safe with fury at his disappearance. "So," Ron said, his voice tight with emotion, "this is where you've been hiding." "I'm not hiding," Harry protested, though even as he said it, he realized how unconvincing it sounded. "Really?" Hermione's voice cracked slightly. "Because leaving school in the middle of the night without proper explanation and then disappearing for 2 days certainly seems like hiding to me. I left you letters. Those weren't explanations. They were goodbye notes." Ron's voice rose dangerously, and somewhere in the house, Mrs. Black's portrait began shrieking again. "You said you couldn't stay at Hogwarts anymore because of something you discovered about Dumbledore, but you didn't tell us what. You said you were sorry and that it wasn't about us, but then you just vanished." Harry felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on his shoulders. In his focus on escaping Dumbledore's manipulation, he'd forgotten that his departure would hurt the first real friends he'd ever had. "I couldn't tell you everything," he said, quietly. "What I discovered, it wasn't just about me. And I thought if you knew, it would put you in an impossible position." "What kind of impossible position?" Hermione demanded. Harry looked between his friends' expectant faces and realized there was no way to avoid this conversation. "Come upstairs," he said, finally. "The drawing room is more private, and there are things you need to know." The next hour was one of the most difficult of Harry's life. Sitting in the dusty drawing room of Grimmauld Place, he told Ron and Hermione everything, the conversation he'd overheard between McGonagall, Hagrid and Dumbledore, the revelations about his deliberate placement with the Dursleys, the discovery of legal alternatives to Hogwarts education. He watched their faces change as they processed what he was telling them, saw the moment when their anger at his departure transformed into horror at what he'd endured. "He knew," Hermione whispered, her face pale. "Professor Dumbledore knew they were hurting you, and he let it happen anyway." "For the greater good," Harry said bitterly, "to build my character, to make sure I understood suffering so I'd be properly humble when power came to me." Ron's hands had clenched into fists on his lap. That's not right. That's not how you treat someone you're supposed to protect." "No," Harry agreed. "It's not." "So what happens now?" Hermione asked. "You can't just stay hidden forever. And what about your education? What about us?" The last question was asked so quietly, Harry almost missed it. But the vulnerability in Hermione's voice made his chest tighten with guilt. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm trying to figure out what comes next. But I couldn't stay at Hogwarts knowing what I knew. I couldn't sit in the Great Hall and pretend everything was fine while Dumbledore smiled at me from the high table." Before either of his friends could respond, the drawing room door burst open and a familiar voice filled the space with warmth that seemed to banish some of the house's inherent malevolence. "Harry Potter, where have you been, dear?" Molly Weasley swept into the room like a force of nature, her round face flushed from climbing the stairs and her eyes bright with maternal concern. "When Percy's letter arrived this morning, I nearly had a heart attack. Leaving school, living in some strange house, not letting anyone know if you're safe. Honestly, what were you thinking?" Behind her came Arthur Weasley, looking harried and conflicted in his ministry robes. "Molly, perhaps we should let the boy explain." "Explain? Arthur Weasley, this child has been living with people who didn't feed him properly for 10 years, and you want him to explain why he finally decided he'd had enough?" Molly turned her attention back to Harry, and he was startled to see tears in her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, when I think about what those awful people put you through—" "Mrs. Weasley," Harry began, but she cut him off with a fierce hug that nearly knocked him off his chair. "None of that, dear. You're family as far as I'm concerned, and family doesn't abandon each other." She held him at arm's length, studying his face with the same intense focus she usually reserved for checking her children for signs of illness or mischief. "Now, what's this I hear about different families trying to collect you like some sort of prize?" "It's not like that," Harry protested, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Some of them are offering genuine help. And some of them," said a new voice from the doorway, "are offering genuine manipulation disguised as help." Harry looked up to see Bill Weasley leaning against the doorframe, his long red hair tied back, and his casual clothes suggesting he'd come directly from Gringotts without stopping to change. Behind him stood Charlie, looking wind-burned and travel-worn in the way that suggested he'd recently arrived from Romania. "Bill!" Ron jumped up to greet his oldest brother, relief evident in his voice. "Charlie, when did you get here?" "About 20 minutes ago," Charlie replied, settling into one of the room's dusty armchairs. "Mum sent us emergency owls yesterday. Apparently when Harry Potter disappears from Hogwarts and half the pure-blood families in Britain start making moves, it constitutes a family crisis." "It certainly does," Molly said firmly, "especially when those families start treating an 11-year-old boy like a political opportunity rather than a child who needs support." Arthur cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Molly, we need to be careful how we discuss this. My position at the ministry—" "Oh, stuff your position at the ministry!" Molly snapped, rounding on her husband with fire in her eyes. "This is about what's right, Arthur. Not about politics. This boy has been mistreated by adults who were supposed to protect him, and now more adults are circling him like vultures. If you think I'm going to stay quiet about that, because it might be politically inconvenient, you clearly don't know me very well." The silence that followed was broken by a small voice from the corridor outside the drawing room. "Is that really Harry Potter?" Everyone turned to see Ginny Weasley peeking around the doorframe, her red hair hanging in her face and her brown eyes wide with curiosity. She looked even younger than her 10 years, and Harry was struck by how different she seemed from the confident girl he'd imagined based on her family's stories. "Ginny," Bill said gently, "come in and meet Harry properly." She crept into the room like a nervous cat, staying close to the wall and stealing glances at Harry when she thought he wasn't looking. When Molly gestured for her to come closer, she shook her head and remained pressed against the bookshelf. "It's all right," Harry said softly, remembering his own shyness around new people when he'd first arrived at Hogwarts. "I'm just Harry. Not particularly exciting, I'm afraid." Ginny's eyes widened at being addressed directly. "But you're the boy who lived," she whispered. "You defeated you-know-who when you were just a baby. You're the most famous wizard in the world." "That's what everyone keeps telling me," Harry replied with a rueful smile. "But honestly, I don't remember any of it. I'm just an 11-year-old boy who's trying to figure out where he belongs." "But you must be special," Ginny insisted, her voice growing stronger. "All the stories, all the books about you." "Are mostly rubbish," Charlie interrupted gently. "I've read some of them, Ginny. Half of them have Harry defeating dark creatures that don't even exist, and the other half make him sound like some sort of superhero rather than a person." Ginny looked confused and slightly disappointed. "But then why does everyone make such a big deal about him?" "Because sometimes," Bill said thoughtfully, People need heroes more than they need truth. It's easier to believe in someone who's naturally special than to accept that extraordinary things can happen to ordinary people. I'm not ordinary, Harry protested automatically, then stopped, realizing how that sounded. I mean, I can do magic, which is brilliant, but I'm not. I don't feel special. Most of the time I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. Molly made a soft sound of understanding. Of course you do, dear. How could you feel any different, raised by people who told you that magic was freakish and wrong? But Harry, sweetheart, you don't have to be special to be loved. You don't have to be the boy who lived to be part of our family. Your family? If you want to be, Arthur said quietly, and Harry was surprised to see that his earlier conflict about ministry politics seemed to have resolved in favor of fatherly concern. Molly's right. We can't offer you political power or ancient family connections or vast wealth. But we can offer you what you should have had from the beginning. People who care about you for yourself, not for what you represent. It wouldn't be official, Bill added. Not like the formal guardianship arrangements other families are proposing. More like adoption by affection. You'd always have a place at our table, a bed when you need one, and people who'll stand by you regardless of what political winds are blowing. Harry felt his throat constrict with emotion. Even though I left Hogwarts? Even though it might cause problems for Mr. Weasley at the ministry? Especially because of those things, Molly said fiercely. Any family worth having stands together when one of their own is in trouble. That's what real families do. Ginny had crept closer during the conversation, and now she stood near Harry's chair, her earlier shyness replaced by something that looked like determination. If you're really just Harry, she said seriously, and not some sort of superhero, then you probably get lonely sometimes, and scared, and confused about what you're supposed to do. Harry nodded, surprised by her perceptive observation. Well, she continued, everyone in our family gets lonely and scared and confused sometimes. Mum says that's what families are for, to remind you that you're not alone when everything feels too big to handle. The simple wisdom of her words hit Harry harder than any of the political arguments or formal offers he'd received from other families. Here was a 10-year-old girl offering him something no one else had thought to provide, the simple acknowledgement that being famous didn't make him less human, and that being human meant needing people who cared about him unconditionally. I'd like that, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. I'd like to be part of your family, if you'll have me. Molly's response was immediate and overwhelming, another fierce hug that lifted him off his chair and left him breathless with the force of her affection. Around them, the rest of the Weasley family closed ranks, and for the first time since leaving Hogwarts, Harry felt like he might actually be safe. Right then, Charlie said briskly, once Molly had released Harry and dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Now that we've got that settled, we need to talk strategy. Harry's got options to consider and decisions to make, and he's going to need people in his corner who understand the political landscape he's navigating. What do you mean? Ron asked. I mean, Bill replied, that good intentions aren't enough when you're dealing with families who have centuries of experience manipulating political situations to their advantage. Harry needs allies who understand how these games are played, even if we don't have the same resources as the traditional pureblood families. We have something they don't, Arthur said quietly. We have Harry's trust, and we have each other. That's not nothing. As the Weasley family began discussing strategies and options, Harry found himself thinking about the different kinds of offers he'd received. The Malfoys had offered him power and political position. The Greengrasses had offered him protection and political education. The Black family had offered him sanctuary and family heritage. But the Weasleys were offering him something else entirely, the chance to belong somewhere, not because of what he could provide, but because of who he was. It wasn't political, it wasn't strategic, and it certainly wasn't profitable. It was simply love, freely given and freely offered. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter felt like he might actually understand what home was supposed to feel like. Chapter 9. The Longbottom Legacy. The owl that arrived at Grimmauld Place 3 days after Harry's conversation with the Weasleys bore the ancient seal of the Longbottom family, a sword crossed with a flowering branch, pressed into dark green wax that seemed to shimmer with protective charms. Unlike the elaborate invitations from other pure-blood families, this message was brief and direct. Mr. Potter. There are matters of mutual concern that require discussion in absolute privacy. If you are willing, I shall collect you at 2 o'clock this afternoon for tea at Longbottom Manor. My grandson Neville will be present, as the matters we must discuss concern him equally. Most urgently yours, Augusta Longbottom. Harry stared at the letter, his mind immediately going to his shy Gryffindor housemate, who seemed perpetually terrified of his own shadow. Neville Longbottom was perhaps the last person Harry would have expected to be involved in matters of mutual concern, but Augusta Longbottom's reputation preceded her. The woman was known throughout magical Britain as someone who never acted without purpose. Interesting, Tonks said, reading over his shoulder as she set down a plate of sandwiches. Augusta Longbottom doesn't usually make house calls. Must be something important. What do you know about her? Formidable. Traditional in all the best ways. Believes in honor, duty, and protecting people who can't protect themselves. Lost her son and daughter-in-law in the war, but she's never let that break her. Tonks settled into the chair across from him, her hair shifting from its current purple to a more thoughtful brown. If she wants to speak with you privately, it's worth listening to what she has to say. At precisely 2 o'clock, the distinctive crack of apparition echoed through the entrance hall of Grimmauld Place. Harry made his way downstairs to find Augusta Longbottom standing in the doorway, her vulture-topped hat slightly askew, and her handbag clutched firmly in her gloved hands. Beside her stood Neville, looking more nervous than Harry had ever seen him, which was saying something, considering Neville's usual state of perpetual anxiety. "Mr. Potter," Augusta said crisply, her sharp eyes taking in the shabby elegance of the Black family home. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I trust you understand the need for discretion." "Yes, ma'am," Harry replied, suddenly feeling the urge to straighten his robes under her penetrating gaze. "Excellent. Neville, come along. We have much to discuss, and limited time in which to do it." Longbottom Manor was everything Grimmauld Place was not, warm, bright, and filled with the scent of growing things. The drawing room where Augusta led them overlooked extensive gardens that, even in December, showed signs of the magical cultivation for which the Longbottom family was famous. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, but unlike the malevolent watchers in Grimmauld Place, these seemed benevolently interested in the proceedings. "Sit both of you," Augusta commanded, gesturing to 2 chairs arranged facing hers. "Tea will arrive presently, but first we must address the reason for this meeting." She studied both boys with an intensity that made Harry feel as though she could see straight through to his thoughts. Beside him, Neville was practically trembling with nervousness. "Neville," she said finally, "have you ever wondered why your parents were targeted specifically by the Death Eaters who destroyed their minds?" Neville's face went very pale. "Gran, you said they were Aurors and they fought against you-know-who." "True, but incomplete." Augusta's expression softened slightly as she looked at her grandson. "My boy, there are things about your family's history that I have kept from you, waiting until you were old enough to understand their significance. Recent events have made it clear that time has come sooner than I hoped." She turned to Harry, her gaze equally penetrating. "Mr. Potter, what do you know of prophecies?" "Not much," Harry admitted. "I know they exist, and that they're kept in the Department of Mysteries." "Indeed. And like most magical phenomena, They are both more and less significant than people believe. Augusta rose and moved to an ornate writing desk, withdrawing a leather portfolio secured with what looked like very old and very powerful protection charms. 16 years ago, a prophecy was made regarding the downfall of the Dark Lord. A prophecy that has shaped both of your lives in ways you have never understood. Harry felt a chill run down his spine. Beside him, Neville had gone completely still. "You're going to tell us what it says," Harry said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I am, because you both deserve to know the truth about why your childhoods were destroyed." Augusta's voice carried a weight of old grief and fierce determination. "The prophecy speaks of a child born at the end of July who will have the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. A child whom the Dark Lord will mark as his equal, but who will possess power the Dark Lord knows not." The silence that followed was absolute. Harry could hear his heartbeat thundering in his ears, and Neville's breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Both of you were born at the end of July, 1980, Augusta continued relentlessly. "Both of your families defied Voldemort 3 times. Both of you could have been the child of prophecy." "But I'm the one who survived," Harry whispered. "You are the one Voldemort chose to attack first." "Yes. But Mr. Potter, prophecies are not straightforward things. They do not necessarily speak of one person, one moment, one decisive action." Augusta's eyes were bright with something that might have been hope. "They speak of possibilities, of potential futures that depend on choices made by fallible human beings." Neville found his voice, thin and shaky. "Are you saying that I could have been—" "I am saying that the power to vanquish darkness does not reside in one person alone. I am saying that Voldemort's greatest error was believing that by attacking Harry Potter, he eliminated all threat to his existence." Augusta leaned forward, her intensity radiating from every line of her body. "The prophecy speaks of power the Dark Lord knows not." "What power could that be, do you think?" Harry shook his head, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. "The power of standing together," Augusta said simply. "The power of 2 children who refuse to be victims, who choose to prepare themselves for whatever darkness may come. The power of alliance between those who have already paid the price for opposing evil." She opened the leather portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. "Both of your families have ancient connections to the Department of Mysteries. Both have produced auras, unspeakables, and warriors who stood against the darkness of their times. What I am offering you is access to that heritage, training that goes beyond what Hogwarts provides, preparation for challenges that textbooks cannot teach." "What kind of training?" Harry asked. "Combat magic, first and foremost. The sort of practical defensive and offensive spells that might keep you alive if darkness rises again. Occlumency, the art of protecting your mind from intrusion. Ancient family magics that have been passed down through generations of those who fought against the dark." Augusta's smile was sharp as a blade. "And perhaps, most importantly, political and strategic training. If you are to survive what may come, you must understand not just how to fight, but how to lead others in that fight." Neville was staring at her with something approaching wonder. "You want to train us to fight you-know-who. I want to give you the tools to defend yourselves and others, should the need arise. Whether that defense involves fighting Voldemort directly or rallying others to stand against him is not for me to decide." Augusta fixed both boys with her penetrating stare. "But I will not see another generation of children caught unprepared by the return of darkness." "Return?" Harry's voice cracked slightly. "You think he's coming back?" "Mr. Potter, Tom Riddle didn't achieve immortality through conventional means. The magic he used to survive his encounter with you as a baby leaves echoes, traces of his existence that those with the right knowledge can detect." Augusta's expression grew grim. "He is diminished, certainly, weakened, perhaps even close to true death. But gone? I think not. The weight of prophecy and possibility settled around Harry's shoulders like a heavy cloak. For months, he'd been focused on escaping Dumbledore's manipulation and finding a place where he could simply be Harry Potter, not the boy who lived. Now he was being told that his connection to Voldemort might be deeper and more complex than anyone had realized. "Why are you telling us this now?" he asked finally. "Because Dumbledore has lost the moral authority to guide your preparation, and because recent events have shown that you are capable of making your own choices about your future." Augusta's voice softened slightly. "And because Neville deserves to know that his parents did not suffer for nothing, that their sacrifice was part of something larger, something that may yet require completion." Neville had been silent through most of the conversation, but now he straightened in his chair with something Harry had never seen in him before: determination. "What would the training involve?" Neville asked quietly. "Intensive magical instruction during holidays and weekends, access to family grimoires and ancient spellwork that are not taught in conventional schools, physical conditioning, because magical combat is as much about endurance as it is about power." Augusta smiled at her grandson with obvious pride. "And for you specifically, Neville, training in the family magics that are your birthright. The Longbottoms have always been warriors as much as botanists." "Family magics?" Augusta rose and moved to one of the portraits on the wall, a stern-faced wizard in ancient robes who watched the proceedings with obvious interest. "Great-great-grandfather Algernon," she said conversationally. "Show them." The portrait nodded and drew his wand. What followed was unlike any magic Harry had seen. The wizard's spells seemed to draw power directly from the earth itself, causing flowers to bloom with impossible speed, while thorns sharp as swords erupted from the ground in defensive patterns. "Plant magic," Augusta explained, as the portrait's demonstration ended. "The ability to encourage rapid growth, to shape living wood into weapons or barriers, to communicate with growing things and gain their cooperation. It requires both tremendous magical power and a deep understanding of natural systems." Neville was staring at the portrait with wide eyes. "I could learn to do that?" "With proper training and dedication, yes. Your magical core is more than strong enough, though your confidence has always been your limiting factor." Augusta's smile was warm with grandmotherly affection. "It would require you to stop thinking of yourself as clumsy and start thinking of yourself as powerful." "And what about me?" Harry asked. "I don't have any special family magic that I know of." "The Potter family magic is more subtle but no less formidable," Augusta replied. "Your ancestors were known for their ability to inspire others, to rally people to causes worth fighting for. They produced leaders, Mr. Potter, people who could unite others against common threats." She handed Harry one of the documents from her portfolio. "This is a proposal for a formal alliance between our families, not unlike what other pure-blood families have offered you. But the Longbottom alliance comes with a specific purpose: preparing for the possibility that prophecy may yet require fulfillment." Harry studied the document, noting the careful legal language that spoke of mutual defense, shared resources, and training obligations. But unlike the political maneuvering he'd seen from other families, this felt different, less like exploitation and more like preparation for an inevitable confrontation. "What do we do about school?" he asked. "I can't go back to Hogwarts, not knowing what I know about Dumbledore. Alternative arrangements can be made: private tutoring, correspondence courses, practical experience that carries more weight than classroom theory." Augusta's expression grew thoughtful. "Though I suspect your departure from Hogwarts has already accomplished something Dumbledore never intended. It has forced people to examine their assumptions about what is best for you." "What do you mean?" "I mean that by choosing to leave, you have demonstrated that you are not the passive, manipulable child Dumbledore believed you to be. Other adults, at the Ministry, in influential families, even within Hogwarts itself, are beginning to question whether the great Albus Dumbledore truly has your best interests at heart. The thought that his decision might have broader implications beyond his own situation was both thrilling and terrifying. Harry looked at Neville, who was studying his own copy of the Alliance proposal with an expression of growing determination. "If we do this," Neville said quietly, "we'd be preparing for war. We'd be preparing to defend ourselves and others from those who would use darkness to achieve their goals," Augusta corrected gently. "Whether that preparation ultimately involves active combat is not something we can predict. But Neville, my boy, your parents prepared for war, and when the time came, they stood against evil without flinching. That courage lives in your blood. And in yours, Mr. Potter," she added, turning to Harry. "Your parents chose to fight rather than flee, chose to protect others rather than protect only themselves. The question now is whether you will honor that legacy by preparing to make the same choice if the need arises." Harry thought about the conversation he'd overheard between McGonagall, Hagrid, and Dumbledore, about the years of deliberate suffering meant to shape him into Dumbledore's idea of a proper weapon against darkness, about the difference between being prepared by others for their purposes and choosing to prepare himself for challenges he might face. "I want to be ready," he said finally. "Not for Dumbledore's war, but for whatever comes. I want to be ready to protect the people I care about. And I want to be someone my parents would be proud of," Neville added, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not just their son, but someone worthy of what they sacrificed." Augusta's smile was brilliant with pride and determination. "Then we shall begin immediately. There is much work to be done, and time may be shorter than we hope." As Harry signed his name to the Alliance document, he felt something shift inside him. Not the weight of destiny imposed by others, but the strength that came from choosing his own path toward whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time since leaving Hogwarts, he felt truly ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 10. The Dumbledore Confrontation. The wards around Grimmauld Place screamed. Harry jolted awake from his first peaceful sleep in days, the magical alarms that protected the Black family home echoing through his bones like physical blows. Somewhere in the house, Tonks was shouting instructions, and the ancient Mrs. Black portrait had begun her familiar shrieking, but underneath it all was a sound that made Harry's blood run cold, the musical trill of Phoenix song, but distorted, strained, as if the magnificent bird was in distress. "Harry!" Tonks appeared in his doorway, her hair bright red with alarm, and her wand already drawn. "Someone's trying to force entry through the wards, someone with considerable power." Harry didn't need to ask who it was. He'd been expecting this confrontation since the moment he'd walked away from Hogwarts, and the combination of Phoenix song and overwhelming magical pressure could only mean one thing. Albus Dumbledore had finally come to collect his wayward weapon. "Let him in," Harry said quietly, pulling on his robes with hands that were steadier than he'd expected. "Harry, are you mad? The wards are there for a reason, and they'll hold against anyone who means me harm," Harry replied, surprised by the calm certainty in his own voice. "But this conversation needs to happen, and it might as well be now." Tonks stared at him for a moment, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of the frightened boy she'd been protecting. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because she nodded curtly and lowered her wand. "Right then, but I'm staying close, and if things go badly—" "They won't," Harry said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "At least, not in the way you're worried about." The drawing room of Grimmauld Place had been transformed by the time Harry reached it. The dusty, neglected space now blazed with golden light that seemed to emanate from the magnificent phoenix perched on the back of the largest armchair. Fawkes's red and gold plumage was as beautiful as ever, but the bird's ancient eyes held a sadness that Harry had never seen before. And beneath Fawkes, settled in the chair as if he belonged there, sat Albus Dumbledore. The headmaster of Hogwarts looked older than Harry remembered, his silver hair and beard somehow less lustrous, his blue eyes dimmed behind half-moon spectacles that seemed to have lost their familiar twinkle. But his presence still filled the room with the weight of centuries of accumulated power and knowledge, and when he smiled at Harry, it was with the same gentle grandfatherly expression that had once made the boy feel safe and protected. "Hello, Harry," Dumbledore said softly. "I believe we have much to discuss." "Do we?" Harry remained standing near the doorway, acutely aware of the distance between himself and the man who had shaped so much of his life from the shadows. "I thought I'd made my position quite clear when I left Hogwarts." "Indeed, you made a statement. A rather dramatic one, as I understand it." Dumbledore's smile grew slightly strained around the edges. "But Harry, my dear boy, I fear you may have been acting on incomplete information. There are complexities to your situation that you deliberately kept from me," Harry interrupted, his voice cutting through Dumbledore's gentle tones like a blade. "Just like you deliberately placed me with relatives who treated me like a burden at best and an enemy at worst. Just like you deliberately arranged for me to suffer for 10 years because you thought it would build my character." Dumbledore's expression grew troubled, and he leaned forward in his chair with the careful movements of someone trying to appear non-threatening. "Harry, what you overheard was taken out of context. The protections your mother's sacrifice provided required me to live with blood relatives who shared her DNA. I know. I've done my research." Harry's voice grew harder with each word. "But they didn't require me to sleep in a cupboard. They didn't require me to be starved or beaten or locked away like a shameful secret. Those were choices, Professor. Your choices. The Dursleys were imperfect guardians, certainly. But Harry, they kept you alive. They kept you safe from those who would have used your fame for their own ends, who would have corrupted you with power and privilege before you were old enough to understand the consequences." Dumbledore's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something to a particularly slow child. "Everything I did, every choice I made, was for your protection and for the greater good of the wizarding world." "The greater good." Harry laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Do you know how many times I've heard that phrase in the past week? Do you know how many people have tried to justify their manipulation of me by invoking the greater good? Harry, you must understand. No, Professor, you must understand." Harry stepped fully into the room, and the golden light from Fawkes seemed to brighten around him. "I'm not your weapon. I'm not your carefully crafted tool for defeating dark wizards. I'm an 11-year-old boy who deserves to make his own choices about his life, and those choices don't include returning to your custody so you can continue molding me into whatever you think I need to become." Dumbledore's facade of gentle patience finally cracked, revealing something harder and more desperate underneath. "Harry, you are being influenced by people who do not understand the full scope of what is at stake. The families who have been contacting you, making you promises. They cannot provide the protection you need. They cannot prepare you for what is coming." "And what exactly is coming, Professor?" Harry's voice carried a new edge of confidence that surprised even him. "Because it seems to me that every adult who claims to know what's best for me has a different version of what I need to be prepared for. Tom Riddle is not gone, Harry. Voldemort was weakened by his encounter with you, but not destroyed. The magic he used to preserve his existence beyond death leaves traces, connections that link him to you in ways that... Dumbledore stopped abruptly, as if realizing he was revealing more than he intended. Connections, Harry repeated slowly. What kind of connections? It is complex magic, far beyond what you could understand at your current level of education. Try me. Dumbledore studied Harry's face for a long moment, and whatever he saw there seemed to convince him that evasion would no longer work. The night Voldemort tried to kill you, the rebounded curse created a link between your minds. You may find yourself experiencing flashes of his thoughts, his emotions, even his memories. It is why you must return to Hogwarts, Harry. You need training to close your mind to his influence, and I am the only one qualified to provide that training. Occlumency, Harry said quietly. The art of protecting one's mind from intrusion. Yes, I know about it. And you're not the only one qualified to teach it. Dumbledore's expression sharpened with sudden concern. Harry, who has been discussing such advanced magic with you? People who actually care about my welfare rather than how useful I might be in their plans. Harry moved closer to where Fawkes perched, and the phoenix trilled softly in what sounded like approval. People who offered to train me without demanding that I sacrifice my agency in return. Harry, you must listen to reason. Must I? Harry's voice rose, and years of suppressed anger finally broke free. Must I listen to the man who arranged for me to be abused because he thought it would make me more compliant? Must I trust the judgment of someone who thinks a child's suffering is acceptable collateral damage in service of the greater good? Everything I did was necessary. Dumbledore's own composure finally cracked, revealing the steel beneath his grandfatherly exterior. You were the most famous child in the wizarding world, Harry. Without careful management, you would have grown up spoiled, arrogant, expecting others to solve your problems for you. The Dursleys taught you humility, compassion, the value of hard work. The Dursleys taught me that I was worthless, Harry shouted back. They taught me that love was conditional, that I had to earn even basic kindness, that my very existence was a burden on everyone around me. Is that the foundation you wanted for your weapon against dark wizards? You are not a weapon, Dumbledore said, but his voice lacked conviction. Aren't I? Then why did you arrange for Ron Weasley to find me on the Hogwarts Express? Why did you make sure Hermione Granger was researching information that would lead her to befriend me? Why did every major event of my first few months at school seem to be carefully orchestrated to teach me specific lessons about courage and loyalty and sacrifice? Dumbledore went very still, his blue eyes losing their last traces of twinkle. How could you possibly know? Because I started paying attention, Professor. Because when you realize one adult has been manipulating your life, you start looking for other signs of manipulation. Harry's voice grew dangerously quiet. Did you really think I wouldn't notice that my two best friends both happened to approach me with exactly the kind of help I needed, exactly when I needed it most? Did you think I'd never wonder why the Sorting Hat deliberated so long over my placement? Or why certain books kept appearing in the library just when I was researching relevant topics? Harry, you must understand that those friendships are genuine. Are they? How can I be sure of anything when I know you've been pulling strings behind the scenes from the moment I entered the wizarding world? The pain in Harry's voice was raw and undisguised. How can I trust that anything in my life is real when I know you've been manipulating everything to serve your greater good? Fawkes suddenly spread his wings and launched himself from the back of Dumbledore's chair, landing instead on Harry's shoulder with a musical trill that seemed to resonate through the entire room. The phoenix's weight was warm and comforting, and his presence felt like a seal of approval that no human authority could override. "Fawkes," Dumbledore said sharply, his voice carrying unmistakable command. "Come." The Phoenix turned his head to regard his long-time companion, and for a moment the room held its breath. Then Fawkes trilled again, softer this time, but with a note of finality that was unmistakable. He remained firmly perched on Harry's shoulder. "Fawkes!" Dumbledore rose from his chair, his composure completely shattered. "I am your bonded wizard. You will obey—" The Phoenix's response was a song unlike anything Harry had ever heard, beautiful and terrible at once, filled with centuries of loyalty freely given and the deep sorrow of trust betrayed. When the last note faded, Fawkes fixed his ancient gaze on Dumbledore and shook his head with unmistakable deliberation. "He's choosing," Harry said softly, understanding flooding through him as the Phoenix's warm presence settled more firmly on his shoulder. Phoenixes bond with those they deem worthy, don't they? And when that worthiness comes into question— "This is temporary," Dumbledore said, but his voice shook with uncertainty. "When you realize the magnitude of the mistake you're making—" "The only mistake here," said a crisp Scottish voice from the doorway, "was trusting you to put Harry's welfare above your own convenience." Professor McGonagall stepped into the drawing room, her emerald robes pristine and her expression thunderous. Behind her came Tonks, who positioned herself strategically near the door with her wand at the ready. "Minerva," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying a note of desperate relief. "Thank goodness. Please help me explain to Harry why he must return to Hogwarts." "I will do no such thing," McGonagall said crisply. "I've spent the past 3 days reviewing everything we know about Harry's placement with his relatives, everything we know about your oversight of his welfare, and everything we know about the choices you made in his name. Albus, I am ashamed that I trusted you for so long." Dumbledore stared at her, as if she'd struck him. "Minerva, surely you understand that difficult choices. I understand that you placed a 1-year-old child with relatives who despised magic and magic users without any follow-up monitoring or welfare checks. I understand that you ignored multiple reports of concerning behavior and suspicious circumstances. I understand that when Harry arrived at Hogwarts, clearly malnourished and emotionally damaged, you chose to see those signs as character building rather than as evidence of abuse." McGonagall's voice grew harder with each accusation. "What I don't understand is how I convinced myself that your reasons justified the harm you allowed to be done." "Everything I did was to prepare him." "To be your weapon," McGonagall finished coldly. "Yes, Albus, that much has become clear. But Harry Potter is not a weapon. He is a child who deserves protection, guidance, and the freedom to choose his own path. If you cannot see the difference between those things, then perhaps it's time for someone else to ensure his welfare." Dumbledore looked around the room, at Harry standing straight and determined, with Fawkes on his shoulder, at McGonagall radiating fierce protective disapproval, at Tonks with her wand ready to defend against any threat. For the first time since Harry had known him, the great Albus Dumbledore looked truly defeated. "You are making a mistake," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. "All of you. When the darkness rises again, and it will rise again, you will discover that good intentions are not enough to protect the innocent. You will learn that sometimes the greater good requires sacrifices that comfortable consciences cannot accept." "Perhaps," Harry said quietly, "but when that time comes, the choice of what to sacrifice will be mine to make, not yours." Dumbledore stared at him for a long moment, and something in the old wizard's expression shifted. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to see. "You have grown stronger than I anticipated," he said finally, "more independent. That may serve you well, or it may doom us all. I guess we'll find out." Harry replied. Dumbledore nodded slowly, then drew his wand and created a small portal of swirling golden flame. This conversation is not finished, Harry. When you need me, and you will need me, I will be waiting. He stepped through the portal and vanished, leaving only the faint scent of phoenix fire and the lingering weight of unspoken threats. McGonagall moved immediately to Harry's side, her expression transforming from stern disapproval to maternal concern. Are you all right, dear? I think so, Harry said, though he wasn't entirely sure. Breaking free from Dumbledore's influence felt like emerging from a long illness, liberating but also frightening, as if he'd lost something that had once seemed essential to his survival. You did well, Tonks said from her position by the door. Standing up to someone with that kind of power and authority. That takes real courage. Fawkes trilled softly and nuzzled his head against Harry's cheek, the gesture carrying comfort and approval that no words could have conveyed. What happens now? Harry asked. McGonagall's smile was small but genuine. Now you continue making your own choices about your future, and those of us who truly care about your welfare will support whatever path you choose, rather than trying to force you down the one we think you should follow. As the golden light of Fawkes's presence filled the drawing room, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced since learning he was a wizard. The certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people who valued him for who he was, rather than what he might become. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was truly free. Chapter 11. The Choosing Ceremony. The letter Harry sent to Gringotts was brief, formal, and completely unprecedented in the annals of wizarding lore. To the Goblin Nation and the directors of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, I, Harry James Potter, heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter, do hereby request the services of Gringotts Bank in facilitating a selection ritual under the ancient laws of magical sanctuary and family alliance. As I am currently without formal guardianship and have received multiple offers of protection, education, and alliance from various wizarding families, I wish to establish a new precedent for such selections, one conducted in full view of the magical community and under the neutral authority of goblin law. I request that this ceremony be conducted at Gringotts Bank in 7 days' time, with all interested families invited to present their final offers before witnesses. Most respectfully, Harry James Potter, Lord Heir Potter. The response came within hours, delivered by a goblin courier who grinned with sharp-toothed anticipation as he handed Harry a scroll sealed with the complex runes that marked official goblin documentation. Mr. Potter, the Goblin Nation is intrigued by your proposal. No wizard in recorded history has requested a formal selection ritual for matters of guardianship and alliance. However, the ancient laws do provide for such ceremonies, and we find the precedent financially advantageous. Gringotts will provide the ceremonial hall for your selection ritual. Representatives from all families who have made formal offers will be required to present their proposals under truth enchantments. The ceremony will be conducted according to the oldest traditions of magical law, with binding contracts established immediately upon your selections. The fee for such services will be substantial, but given the political and historical significance of this event, we are prepared to discuss payment terms. May your gold multiply. Director Ragnok Gringotts Wizarding Bank word of Harry's selection. Ritual spread through the wizarding world like fiend fire. Within 2 days, every major newspaper in magical Britain was reporting on the unprecedented ceremony. The Daily Prophet's headline screamed, "A boy who lived to choose new family in ancient ritual," while Witch Weekly breathlessly speculated about which families would be selected and what it might mean for future political alliances. More significantly, representatives from families Harry hadn't even heard of began requesting permission to attend as observers. The ceremony that had begun as a practical solution to his guardianship situation was rapidly becoming the most significant political event in decades. "You realize," Tonks said, as she helped Harry review the final guest list, "that what you're doing is going to change everything? Not just for you, but for every magical child who comes after you." "How do you mean?" "You're establishing the precedent that children have agency in their own guardianship arrangements, that they can evaluate offers, make informed choices, and enter into formal alliances on their own behalf." Her hair shifted to a thoughtful auburn as she considered the implications. There are going to be a lot of unhappy parents who've been counting on arranged marriages and automatic political alliances. Harry felt a flutter of nervousness at the scope of what he was apparently setting in motion, but also a fierce satisfaction. If his choice helped other children avoid the powerlessness he'd experienced, then the political upheaval would be worth it. The morning of the selection ritual dawned crisp and bright, and Harry found himself standing before the mirror in his room at Grimmauld Place, adjusting the formal robes that Andromeda had helped him select. They were deep green with silver threading, colours that honoured his mother's eyes and his Slytherin heritage without claiming allegiance to any particular family. "Ready?" McGonagall asked from the doorway. She had offered to escort him to Gringotts, a gesture that meant more to Harry than he could easily express. "I think so," Harry replied, though his stomach was doing complicated acrobatics at the thought of the day ahead. "Remember," she said gently, "you are not choosing a master or a new form of control. You are choosing allies and advisors who will support your own decisions about your future. The power in those relationships must always remain with you." The ceremonial hall of Gringotts was unlike anything Harry had ever seen. The vast underground chamber was carved directly from the bedrock beneath London, with columns that seemed to stretch up into darkness and walls covered in goblin runes that pulsed with ancient magic. At the centre of the space stood a raised platform surrounded by curved seating that had been arranged to accommodate the dozens of witnesses who had requested permission to attend. Harry took his place on the platform, acutely aware of the weight of history pressing down around him. In the audience, he could see representatives from every major wizarding family in Britain, some hopeful, others calculating, all intensely focused on the proceedings about to unfold. Director Ragnok approached the platform with the measured dignity that goblins reserved for their most significant ceremonies. In his hands, he carried a golden sphere covered in intricate runes that seemed to shift and change as Harry watched. "We gather today," Ragnok announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall without magical amplification, to witness an event unprecedented in the recorded history of wizard-goblin relations. Harry James Potter, Lord Heir of the ancient and noble House of Potter, has invoked his right under the oldest laws of magical alliance to choose his own guardians and protectors through formal ritual. The golden sphere in Ragnok's hands began to glow with warm light, and Harry felt something settle around his shoulders like an invisible mantle, the weight of ceremonial magic that would ensure all proceedings were conducted with absolute honesty. "Let the first family present their offer," Ragnok commanded. To Harry's surprise, it was Augusta Longbottom who stepped forward first, her spine straight and her expression dignified. Beside her stood Neville, looking nervous but determined in formal robes that made him appear older than his 11 years. "The ancient and noble house of Longbottom," Augusta announced, her voice carrying the authority of centuries, "offers alliance to Harry Potter in the form of martial training, magical education, and preparation for the challenges that prophecy may require him to face. We offer not guardianship, but partnership, a bond between equals who share the burden of destiny." The truth enchantments around the ceremony platform glowed brightly, confirming the sincerity of her words. Harry felt a warm pulse of recognition from the magic itself, acknowledging the genuine nature of what was being offered. "The House of Longbottom is acknowledged," Ragnok declared. "Let the second family present their offer." Lord Cyrus Greengrass stepped forward next, accompanied by both his daughters. Daphne met Harry's eyes directly, her expression calm and supportive, while Astoria beamed at him with obvious enthusiasm. "The ancient and noble house of Greengrass," Lord Cyrus said formally, "offers primary guardianship to Harry Potter, including magical protection, political education, and full family rights and privileges. We offer not adoption, but alliance, the chance to belong to a family that will support his choices rather than making choices for him." Again, the truth enchantments confirmed the genuine nature of the offer. But more than that, Harry could see in Daphne's eyes the same recognition and respect that had drawn him to her in the first place, the acknowledgement that he was a person worthy of choice rather than a prize to be won. One by one, the other families presented their offers. The Malfoys, speaking through Narcissa rather than Lucius, offered political training and wealth, but their truth enchantments flickered uncertainly around the edges, suggesting reservations and conditions that weren't being explicitly stated. The Bones family offered legal protection and ministry connections. Several other pure-blood families offered various combinations of resources, training, and political alliance. But it was Andromeda Tonks who surprised everyone by stepping forward without formal family backing. "I speak not for an ancient house," she said clearly, "but for the principle that children deserve protection from those who would use them. I offer Harry Potter the sanctuary of Grimmauld Place, the knowledge of black family magic, and the unwavering loyalty of those who choose justice over convenience." Tonks moved to stand beside her mother, her hair a brilliant gold that caught the ceremonial lighting. "And I offer my skills as an aura and metamorphmagus in Harry's protection, not as a servant, but as a friend who believes he deserves the freedom to choose his own path." When all the offers had been presented, Ragnok turned to Harry with an expression that might have been approval. "Lord Herr Potter, you have heard all offers made under the ancient laws of truth and witnessed magic. The choice is yours to make, and the magical contracts will be binding upon all parties according to your selections." Harry stood slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the hall focused upon him. This was it, the moment that would define not just his own future, but potentially the future of magical children throughout Britain. "I thank all families for their offers," he began, his voice carrying more strongly than he'd expected. "What I choose today, I choose freely and with full understanding of the responsibilities that come with alliance and guardianship." He turned first to Augusta Longbottom. "I accept the alliance offered by House Longbottom. Neville and I will stand together as partners in whatever challenges come, and I gratefully accept your offer of training and magical education." The first contract materialized in golden light, hovering between Harry and Augusta until both reached out to touch it, sealing the alliance with magic that resonated through the entire hall. "I accept the primary guardianship offered by House Greengrass," Harry continued, meeting Daphne's eyes as he spoke. "I choose to become part of your family, not through adoption, but through alliance and mutual respect." The second contract formed and was sealed, and Harry could have sworn he saw Daphne's eyes brighten with tears of happiness. "And I accept the protection and sanctuary offered by Andromeda Tonks and her daughter Nymphadora, claiming my right as heir to the Black family properties and embracing the friendship offered without condition or reservation." The final contract settled into place, and Harry felt something shift in the magical atmosphere of the hall, a sense of completion, of choices made freely, and bonds forged in truth rather than convenience. "It is witnessed and sealed," Ragnok announced, and the satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. "Let it be recorded that on this day, Harry James Potter chose his own path and established new precedent under the ancient laws. May his choices prove wise, and may his alliances prove strong. As the formal ceremony concluded and the witnesses began to disperse, Harry found himself surrounded by his chosen allies, Augusta and Neville representing strength and preparation, Cyrus and Daphne representing family and political guidance, and Andromeda and Tonks representing sanctuary and unconditional support. "So," Daphne said quietly, as the crowds thinned around them, "how does it feel to have made history?" "Terrifying and wonderful at the same time," Harry replied honestly. "Like I've finally taken control of my own life." "You have," Tonks said firmly, her hair cycling through several brilliant colors as her emotions shifted. "And you've done it in a way that honors everyone involved while establishing your own independence. I'm proud of you, Harry Potter." As they made their way out of Gringotts and into the London afternoon, Harry reflected on how much had changed since that night he'd overheard Dumbledore discussing his conditioning with McGonagall and Hagrid. He had walked away from manipulation and control, faced down the most powerful wizard in Britain, and established alliances based on mutual respect and genuine care. Most importantly, he had chosen his own path, not the path Dumbledore had laid out for him, not the path various families had hoped to guide him down, but the path that felt right for who he wanted to become. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter's future belonged entirely to him. And that, he thought, as Fawkes trilled approvingly from his shoulder, felt exactly like freedom should. Chapter 12. The New Order. 6 months later. June 1992. Harry Potter stood at the window of his study in Greengrass Manor, watching the summer sun set over the estate's perfectly manicured grounds, and reflected on how completely his life had changed since that December morning when he'd walked away from Hogwarts. The boy who had once slept in a cupboard under the stairs was now heir to one of Britain's most politically influential families, trained by some of the most formidable witches and wizards in the country, and about to take his seat in the Wizengamot as the youngest member in its 1,000-year history. The study itself was a testament to how much had changed. The walls were lined with books on magical lore, political theory, and advanced spellwork, subjects he'd never imagined studying at age 11. His desk was covered with correspondence from across the magical world, invitations to political events, and reports from the network of allies and contacts that had grown around him like a protective web. But perhaps the most significant change was in Harry himself. The scared, manipulated child who had discovered Dumbledore's betrayal 6 months ago had grown into someone who moved confidently through the complex world of wizarding politics, someone who could hold his own in conversations with adults who had decades more experience, someone who had learned to wield influence as skillfully as he wielded magic. "Brooding again," Daphne's voice came from the doorway, carrying the fond exasperation that had become familiar over the months they'd lived as part of the same family. At nearly 12 years old, she had grown as much as Harry had, developing from a clever but sheltered, pure-blood heiress into someone who could match him in both magical ability and political acumen. "Reflecting," Harry corrected, turning from the window to face her. "Tomorrow changes everything again." "Tomorrow makes official what everyone already knows," she replied, settling into the chair across from his desk with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. "You've been acting as head of House Potter in all but name for months. Taking your Wizengamot seat just makes it formal." She was right, of course. Over the past 6 months, Harry had gradually assumed the political responsibilities that came with his heritage. He'd negotiated trade agreements that affected Potter family investments. He'd mediated disputes between allied families. He'd even testified before ministry committees about child welfare reforms that had grown out of his own experiences. "Any word from Tonks about the trial preparation?" Daphne asked. Harry's expression grew serious. "The evidence package is complete. 300 pages of documented irregularities in the original investigation, testimony from witnesses who were never interviewed, and magical analysis proving that Sirius couldn't have been the secret keeper based on the residual charm traces at the scene." The campaign to free Sirius Black had been one of Harry's first major political initiatives, and it had required every resource his new alliances could provide. Augusta Longbottom's connections in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had secured access to the original investigation files. The Greengrass family's legal expertise had identified the procedural violations that had denied Sirius a proper trial. Andromeda Tonks's insider knowledge of pure-blood family dynamics had revealed the political pressures that had made Sirius a convenient scapegoat. Most importantly, Neville's growing confidence and magical ability had helped uncover evidence that more experienced investigators had missed. His developing talent for plant magic had allowed him to analyze trace evidence from the crime scene in ways that conventional magical forensics couldn't match. "He'll be free by the end of the week," Harry said with quiet satisfaction, "and Peter Pettigrew will finally face justice for what he did to my parents." The capture of Peter Pettigrew had been perhaps the most dramatic success of Harry's new intelligence network. Tonks, working with her fellow Aura trainees, had tracked the animagus to a wizarding community in Scotland, where he'd been living under an assumed identity. His confession under Veritaserum had not only freed Sirius, but had also revealed information about Voldemort's supporters that the Ministry had been seeking for over a decade. "That's not all Pettigrew revealed, is it?" Daphne said quietly. Harry's expression darkened. "No. The intelligence about Voldemort's survival methods, the locations of his supporters, the evidence that he's been slowly regaining strength." He trailed off, remembering the sick feeling that had settled in his stomach when he'd read Pettigrew's full confession. If we hadn't started building our own information networks, if we'd still been depending on Dumbledore's Order of the Phoenix for intelligence, Voldemort might have returned to full power before anyone realized the threat was real. It had been Neville who first suggested that they needed better information about potential dark magical activity. His family's connections to the Department of Mysteries, combined with Augusta's pragmatic approach to preparation, had led to the creation of an informal network of contacts throughout the Ministry, St. Mungo's, and even the international magical community. When Pettigrew's confession had revealed that several of Voldemort's Horcruxes were still hidden in various locations, that network had proven invaluable in tracking them down. The locket from a cave that Sirius had known about from his family's dark artifacts, the cup hidden in Bellatrix Lestrange's Gringotts vault, even the diadem that had been concealed in Hogwarts itself for decades. 5 Horcruxes destroyed, Harry said, consulting a list on his desk. 1 remaining, according to the calculations, and Tom Riddle himself reduced to barely more than a wraith, hiding in forests and abandoned buildings, too weak to possess anyone for more than a few hours at a time. All because you chose to walk away from Dumbledore's control and build something better, Daphne observed. A soft knock at the study door interrupted their conversation. Lord Cyrus Greengrass entered, carrying a leather portfolio that Harry recognized as containing the most sensitive political correspondence. "Harry, my apologies for the interruption, but we've received some interesting intelligence from our contacts in the Ministry," Cyrus said, his expression grave. "It seems that Albus Dumbledore has been making inquiries about tomorrow's Wizengamot session. Specifically, he's been asking about the procedures for challenging the appointment of underage members." Harry felt a familiar chill at the mention of Dumbledore's name. Over the past 6 months, the former headmaster had made several attempts to reassert his influence over Harry's situation. None had been successful, but each had been more desperate and more concerning than the last. "Does he have grounds for a challenge?" Harry asked. "Legally?" "No. Your appointment was confirmed by Goblin inheritance law, validated by the Ministry's Department of Magical Heritage, and supported by written testimony from 4 different pure-blood families attesting to your political competence." Cyrus's smile was sharp, but Dumbledore has never been overly concerned with legal niceties when they conflicted with his vision of the greater good. "What do you think he'll try?" "Public pressure, most likely. An appeal to the Wizengamot's traditional reluctance to seat underage members, perhaps combined with concerns about your radical approaches to child welfare reform." Cyrus settled into another chair, his expression thoughtful. The man still commands considerable respect among the older members, particularly those who remember his role in the war against Grindelwald. "Then we'll be ready for him," Harry said calmly. "Augusta will be there to speak for the traditional families who support my appointment. Amelia Bones will present the Ministry's official endorsement, and if necessary, Sirius will testify about what Dumbledore's idea of child protection actually entailed." The thought of facing Dumbledore again in such a public forum should have terrified Harry, but instead he felt only a cold determination. The scared 11-year-old who had discovered his headmaster's betrayal was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to fight manipulation with political skill and emotional truth with documented evidence. "There's something else," Cyrus said, opening his portfolio. "We've received word that several foreign magical governments are planning to send observers to tomorrow's session. Apparently, your selection ritual and the reforms it's inspired have attracted international attention." He handed Harry a letter bearing the seal of the French Ministry of Magic. "The International Confederation of Wizards is considering new protocols for child welfare oversight, based in part on the precedents you've established. There's talk of creating formal procedures for children to petition for guardianship review, requirements for regular welfare checks on magical orphans, even restrictions on the kinds of character building, practices that adults can impose on children in their care." Harry stared at the letter, overwhelmed by the scope of what his simple decision to leave Hogwarts had apparently set in motion. "I never intended to change international law. The best changes often come from people who weren't trying to change everything, just trying to fix what was broken in their own lives," Daphne said softly. As evening settled over Greengrass Manor, Harry found himself in the garden with Neville, practicing the advanced combat spells that Augusta had been teaching them. Over the past 6 months, his friend had transformed almost beyond recognition. The nervous, forgetful boy from Hogwarts was gone, replaced by someone whose confidence grew stronger with each successful spell, whose magical power seemed to increase every week, and who could now face adult wizards in dueling practice without flinching. "Ready for tomorrow?" Neville asked as they concluded their practice session. "As ready as anyone can be for making history," Harry replied, "though I keep thinking about what McGonagall said when she visited last month, about how we've proved that children don't have to be passive victims of adult decisions. We've also proved that adults don't always know best," Neville added. "Your godfather would have died in Azkaban if you hadn't demanded a real investigation. Voldemort would have returned to full power if you hadn't built intelligence networks that Dumbledore's people missed. How many other things have been wrong simply because no one questioned the people in authority?" It was a sobering thought, and one that had driven much of Harry's work over the past months. The child welfare reforms, the investigative protocols, the requirement that all guardianship arrangements be subject to regular review, all of it had grown out of the simple recognition that adults with power didn't always use it wisely, and that children deserved protection from the consequences of adult failings. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Harry found himself standing before the full assembly of the Wizengamot for the first time since the day of his parents' murder. The ancient chamber was packed beyond capacity, with observers from across the magical world crowding the galleries and representatives from major families filling every available seat. At the center of it all sat the ornate chair that had belonged to the Potter family for over 3 centuries, empty now except for the ceremonial sword and wand that marked it as awaiting its rightful heir. "Harry James Potter," called the chief warlock, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, "step forward to claim your inherited seat in this body." Harry walked to the center of the chamber, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes following his progress. He could see Dumbledore sitting among the elder members, his face carefully neutral, but his blue eyes sharp with calculation. He could see Augusta Longbottom and Cyrus Greengrass among the family representatives, their expressions proud and supportive. He could see ministry officials, foreign observers, and journalists all watching to see what would happen next. But most clearly, he could see Sirius Black sitting in the section reserved for recently freed prisoners, his face thin from his years in Azkaban, but his eyes bright with the first hope Harry had ever seen in them. "By right of blood, by right of inheritance, and by right of demonstrated political competence," Harry said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I claim the seat of the ancient and noble house of Potter." "Are there any who would challenge this claim?" the chief warlock asked. The silence stretched for a long moment, and Harry began to think that Dumbledore had decided not to make his move after all. Then the former headmaster rose slowly to his feet, his presence commanding attention, even from those who disagreed with him. "I do not challenge Lord Potter's legal right to his inheritance," Dumbledore said carefully. "But I do question whether seating a 12-year-old child, however remarkable, in this body serves the interests of either the child or the wizarding world he would help govern." Murmurs rippled through the chamber, but Harry felt only calm certainty as he prepared to respond. "Respected Chief Warlock," Harry said formally, "I would ask Professor Dumbledore a question, if I may." "Proceed." Harry turned to face Dumbledore directly, meeting the old wizard's eyes without flinching. "Professor, in your opinion, at what age does a wizard become capable of making important decisions about his own welfare and future?" Dumbledore's expression grew wary. "That depends on many factors, Mr. Potter. Magical maturity, life experience, the guidance of wise counselors." "And who determines when those factors are sufficient?" Harry interrupted gently. "Those with the experience and wisdom to make such judgments." "I see. And if those experienced, wise adults make choices that harm the child in their care, what recourse does that child have?" The chamber had gone completely silent. Dumbledore's face had gone pale, and Harry could see recognition dawning in his eyes, the understanding that this was not a random philosophical discussion, but a carefully planned confrontation. "In such cases," Dumbledore said slowly, "other adults with proper authority would intervene to protect the child's interests." Would they? Even if the adult making harmful choices was considered the most powerful and respected wizard of his generation. Even if those other adults trusted his judgment implicitly and never questioned his decisions. "Mr. Potter," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "this is hardly the appropriate venue for discussing child welfare, for examining the systems that are meant to protect magical children from abuse and neglect." Harry's voice grew stronger, more confident. "Respected members of the Wizengamot, 6 months ago I was a child living with relatives who had abused me for 10 years, placed there by an adult who knew about that abuse and considered it acceptable because it served his idea of the greater good." The murmurs in the chamber grew louder, and several members turned to stare at Dumbledore with expressions of shock and growing concern. "Today, I am a child who has been educated by some of the finest minds in magical Britain, who has helped free an innocent man from wrongful imprisonment, who has contributed to the capture of a dangerous war criminal, and who has established political alliances that serve not just my own interests, but the interests of everyone who believes that power should be exercised responsibly. Harry turned to address the full chamber. The question is not whether I am old enough to make decisions about my own life. The question is whether this body will continue to allow adults to make decisions about children's lives without oversight, without accountability, and without regard for the actual welfare of those children. The Chief Warlock called for order as the chamber erupted in discussion, but Harry could see that his point had been made. In the galleries, he spotted familiar faces, Tonks giving him a proud grin, McGonagall dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even some of his former Hogwarts classmates who had somehow gained admission to witness the proceedings. "The chair recognizes Madam Bones," the Chief Warlock announced. Amelia Bones rose with the crisp authority that had made her one of the most respected officials in the Ministry. "Chief Warlock, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement has reviewed Lord Potter's case extensively. We have found clear evidence of systematic failures in child protection protocols, failures that might have continued indefinitely if Lord Potter had not chosen to take action on his own behalf." She gestured to a thick folder of documents. "Based on our investigation, the Ministry is implementing new requirements for regular welfare checks on all magical orphans, mandatory review of all guardianship arrangements, and formal procedures for children to petition for alternative care when their current situation is inadequate. Furthermore," Bones continued, "Lord Potter's political activities over the past 6 months have demonstrated a level of competence, judgment, and ethical reasoning that many adults never achieve. The Ministry formally endorses his appointment to this body." Augusta Longbottom rose next. "The traditional families of magical Britain have observed Lord Potter's conduct with great interest. We have found him to be honourable, intelligent, and committed to principles that honour the best traditions of our society, while protecting those who cannot protect themselves." One by one, other members of the Wizengamot rose to speak in Harry's favour. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimony about his political work, documentation of his educational progress, letters of support from allies across the magical world. When the formal vote was called, it wasn't even close. Harry James Potter was confirmed as the youngest member of the Wizengamot in its 1,000-year history by a margin of nearly 3-1. As he took his seat in the ancient chair that had belonged to his family for generations, Harry felt the weight of history and responsibility settling around his shoulders. But it was a weight he carried willingly, chosen freely rather than imposed by others. "The chair recognizes Lord Potter," the Chief Warlock announced. Harry rose to address the chamber for the first time as a full member, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who had earned his place through struggle and determination rather than simply inheriting it. "Respected members," he said, "I stand before you today, not as a child seeking adult protection, but as someone who has learned that true strength comes not from power over others, but from the wisdom to use power in service of justice. I pledge to bring that understanding to every vote I cast and every alliance I forge in this chamber." As the session concluded and members began to file out, Harry remained seated for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. 6 months ago, he had been a powerless child trapped in an abusive situation, his entire life controlled by adults who claimed to know what was best for him. Today, he was Lord Potter, member of the Wizengamot, head of one of Britain's most influential magical families, and a political force in his own right. The boy who had once been manipulated and controlled had become someone who could shape the future of the wizarding world. And as Sirius Black approached his chair with tears of pride streaming down his thin face, Harry Potter smiled and prepared to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. He was finally, truly free.